We're just going to kind of continue with what we discussed last class. You're probably going to get out early today. It's a pretty straightforward lesson. So what our lesson today is, we're going to look at how society began reacting to industrialism. Last week we talked about the causes of industrialism, the immediate effects of industrialism. Now we're going to talk about some more of the long-term effects. We're actually going to be dealing a little bit more with economics today. We're going to be talking about economic theory in a little bit more detail. So, with industrialization came a few unforeseen consequences. First off, you had city growth. Massive city growth. City growth the likes of which no one had ever seen before. And that created that just opened up Pandora's box for a whole bunch of problems with the cities. You had outbreaks of new diseases in stronger strains, and worse outbreaks, and all kinds of things. Typhus, cholera, dysentery, tuberculosis, all kinds of things. On top of that, you had a restructuring of Western class systems or class structures. So factory work led to a dramatic separation of social classes. In the fact that you had the industrial class, the ultra-rich, the ones who own the factories, the ones who own the businesses, and then you had the working class, which were the really poor, and then in the middle you had the middle class. And there were clear so what I'm looking for, I'm having a brain fart already. There were clear differences between the three classes. So how do you deal with that? As for the working class, the working class kind of got the short end of the stick during industrialism. We talked about this last week. And that's because artisan skills, as we talked about last week, had fallen obsolete. And the working class, really the only thing they had of value that they could market was their labor. But as industrialism became more machine-driven, the ability or the skills required to work in factories began to get a lot simpler. So that meant that working class people, factory workers, really didn't need a whole lot of skills in order to work and make money. And the hours were long, the work was monotonous, and a lot of working class people had a hard time finding satisfaction in life. Because finding happiness was really hard. What compounded the issue was that working class folks had more time to themselves, especially as factory jobs began, or the working hours began being limited. But they also had more money in their pockets than they would have if they worked on the farm. And that meant they got up to shenanigans. So you started seeing an uptick in crime, and specifically alcoholism, as working class men would go work during the day, and then they would collect their wages, and they'd go out with their buddies to a pub, or to a bar, or to a restaurant, and get drunk, and get rowdy, and start fighting. So as alcoholism and crime increased, we started seeing a decay, a breakdown of traditional family values, mostly because a lot of the men that were working in the factories got lost, they got directionless. This, by the way, is one of the leading causes for why the United States implemented prohibition in the 1920s. 19teens, I'm sorry. And the reason being was there was something called the temperance movement. Has anybody ever heard of that? The women's Christian temperance movement came to the conclusion that a lot of spousal abuse and child abuse that was happening in the day or at the time period was a result of men turning to alcoholism for work. So the women's Christian temperance movement advocated that if you can ban alcohol, then you'd be able to fix society. So starting in the 1800s, they began pushing for the prohibition of alcohol, which eventually was made into law with the passage of the 18th Amendment during the Wilson administration. So alcohol was made illegal in order to try to combat the problems facing working class people as they were dealing with increased alcoholism and crime. Traditional family values began to decay, and what you also started seeing was a shrinking of the family unit during industrialism. So before industrialism, Europeans kind of lived like the rest of the world, in that they lived in a household that had a whole lot of people living in it, your cousins, your aunts, your uncles, your grandparents, all living in one household. Kind of like the way the rest of the world operated. But during industrialism, that family unit began to shrink. And the reason being was because wages were increasing and people that took factory jobs were able to make steadier wages. And what that meant was that just the nuclear family, which is the parents and the children, became financially viable. You no longer needed other members of the family living under the same roof in order to pay your bills. Two working people, or even just the father working, would be able to provide for the rest of the family, and then it would just be a household with the parents and the kids. That's what we call the nuclear family. This gave rise to a philosophy known as existentialism. You don't have to write it down. I'm going to put it up on the board anyway. But you're going to get the lecture notes next week, so you don't need it. But existentialism is the philosophy that each individual is solely responsible for giving meaning to life and living life authentically. Essentially what that means is that finding meaning is up to each person, not to society and not to religious doctrine. It's a very individualistic outlook on life. And it's a natural expansion of Romanticism, which was in the lecture notes from 2 weeks ago. And Romanticism talked about the primacy of the individual. Well, if Romanticism says that the individual is prime, then existentialism says, well, if the individual is all important, then it's up to you to live your life. That's essentially what it means. Now, what that meant as an effect on society, it's no secret that the Industrial Revolution was a result of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment happens, people start questioning the natural order of things, begin asserting their political power, pushing for equality, and it opens the door for people to begin to innovate economically as well, because, I mean, how else can you liberate yourself better than making more money, if you think about it? So industrialism was a result of the Enlightenment, and if the Enlightenment's goal was for the liberation of the common people, restructure the political system, grant legal equality to those who were living in a specific society, if that was the goal, industrialism began eroding those goals. And that's because you had the economic shift, especially in the industrial work, especially for the working class and for the women. So the industrial age was started because of Enlightenment, but the challenges of industrialism began undermining the goals of Enlightenment, specifically to women and working class men. So what social thinkers began looking at was trying to find a way to tweak the system, to kind of restructure the system so that the working class would be able to find value in their lives and enjoy the fruits of the Enlightenment with their newfound political freedoms. Because it's hard to enjoy political freedoms when you're a working stiff. I mean, essentially what was happening was the working class was more or less becoming slaves to the machines that they worked on. So this is where you have the emergence of capitalism and socialism. Capitalism is the system we operate under, and socialism has been in the news a lot, so we'll talk about both of them. Capitalism is an economic system based on markets, private property ownership, the private ownership of the means of production, the profit motive, and voluntary exchange. Socialism is a political and social theory of social organization that advocates that the means of production, distribution, and exchange should be owned or regulated by the community as a whole. Now that can mean one of two things. Either have communal ownership, which is just a group of people owning things, or everything is property of the government. More often than not, it becomes property of the government. Both systems have pros and cons. I'm not going to be one of those blind ideologues that talk about how one is better than the other, because I know that both of them have weaknesses. We'll start with capitalism. The pros of capitalism is there is a high degree of choice for goods and services. Want proof of that? Just go to any grocery store or any shopping mall. There's a plethora of things for you to choose from. There's also a high level of economic mobility in capitalist systems, because capitalism doesn't care who your parents are. Capitalism only cares what you can do and what you can achieve. So in a capitalist system, you could be born poor, innovate something, and die rich. Doesn't matter who your parents are. Capitalism rewards skilled labor and innovation. If you work hard, if you invent something, you will be able to reap the fruits of your labor. There's also a dramatic improvement of living standards in capitalism. Because of the competitive nature of capitalism, manufacturers and producers are, in an attempt to compete with each other in order to boost sales, will start offering higher quality products and services for lower costs, because they're trying to attract more customers. And as costs come down, more and more consumers are able to get access to certain things that were off limits to them before due to the difficulty in cost. So consider flat screen TVs. Just a couple of years ago, flat screen TVs were about $2,000. Now they're like $600 or $700. In the 1980s, microwaves were considered a luxury. Now everybody has a microwave. So that's what I'm talking about with improved standards of living. As time goes on, as the market competes with itself and innovates, luxury goods, which everybody desires, the price of that comes down and it becomes more accessible to commoners and people with lower incomes. So there's a dramatic improvement of living standards under capitalist systems. And there is little to no true poverty. Now I want to make this very, very clear. There is a difference between true poverty and relative poverty. Poverty is one of those terms that we throw around like it's a blanket term. There's actually two parts of it. True poverty is not having enough to eat. If you are starving to death, you are in true poverty. Relative poverty is if your neighbor has more product or has more wealth than you do. The United States has a lot of relative poverty. We have very little true poverty. We almost have no true poverty. I mean, even homeless in the United States don't starve to death. The cons of capitalism is that public services are difficult to come by. The more pure the capitalist system is, the more difficult it is to get public services. In a purely capitalistic system, there would be no military, there'd be no fire department, there'd be no police. If you wanted to protect your house from fire in a purely capitalist system, you would have to pay into a subscription for a fire service to pay for the service. Instead of police, you and your neighborhood would have to hire a private security firm. There would be no military, you'd have to be in a militia for that. There'd be no health coverage, there'd be no public transportation. The more capitalistic you get, the more public services you'll lose. Low-skilled laborers also have very few opportunities for economic advancement because capitalism likes innovation and hard work. If you're a worker that doesn't have a whole lot of skills, because you're not able to market those skills, you're not really going to get anywhere until you learn a new skill. Capitalism also has more dramatic boom and bust cycles of the markets. We'll talk more about this when we talk about the causes of the Great Depression, but just know that capitalism, because of market fluctuations, because industries rise, decay, and then collapse, the market goes up, goes down, goes up, goes down, and if you have your money invested in the market, you can get damaged by this economically. So the boom and bust cycle of capitalism can throw markets into complete chaos. It also means that you don't really have a whole lot of job security in a capitalist system. Social divisions based on class dominate society, and that's because of the competitive nature of capitalism. You will have the ultra poor. You will have the ultra rich. Most people will fall somewhere in the middle, though, in a capitalist system. There's also high levels of relative poverty, like what I said. And that's because, once again, the competitive nature of capitalism. Someone being a little bit more cutthroat or a little bit more innovative means that they're going to reap the rewards of their hard work or innovation that their neighbors won't. Capitalists believe that success and failure should begin and end with each individual. Capitalism is an extremely individualistic economic system. The emphasis is placed on freedom over stability. And we'll talk about what that means in just a second. But a capitalist would say something along the lines of, for people to have the right to succeed, they must also have the right to fail. That's what capitalism ultimately boils down to. You live and die based on your own ability. But capitalists believe that through experience and personal growth, individuals gradually improve their lives through a combination of hard work, good decision making, and a little bit of luck. It's really hard in a capitalist system for poor people to stay poor. On the flip side, it's also really hard in a purely capitalistic system for rich people to stay rich. Capitalism, even though you have the ability to filter to the extreme, most people congregate in the middle. Capitalism is also a highly individualized system, which means it is poorly equipped to meet the needs and wants of collectives. An example of a shortcoming of capitalist systems is, let's say, medical coverage for retirees. If you've retired, you are out of the market, which means you are living on the nest egg that you've built for yourself. Well, if your nest egg runs out in a purely capitalist system, that's it. You have to rely on your family. No one else is going to support you. And that is a weakness of a capitalist system, is that people who are least able to take care of themselves, the old and the young, usually the ones that fall by the wayside. And that's because capitalism is competitive. Socialism has some pros and cons as well. The good things about socialism is that social services are provided by the state. You want medical coverage? Government provides it. You want transportation? Government provides it. Fire, police, military, education, all of that is provided by the government, which means you don't have to worry about it. Fairness is also highly valued under a socialist system. That's why you'll hear a lot of people in modern politics, especially as socialism grows in popularity in the United States, a lot of people will use catchwords like fair. During the next election cycle, I would recommend that you watch the primaries, because there are a couple of people who are open socialists that are going to be running for the Democratic ticket, and then obviously Donald Trump is going to run for re-election as a Republican. But watch the primaries and watch all of the campaigns, because in the Democratic primaries, those candidates are probably going to be talking a lot about fairness, whereas in Republicans, they're going to be talking a lot about freedom. And that's been the case for the last several election cycles. So fairness is highly valued with socialists. Standards of living are also theoretically equal under socialist systems. And social classes are in theory, eliminated. Because all of your basic needs will be met by the state. The downside of socialism is that there's a high level of government interference, bureaucracy, and corruption, especially as the government gets bigger. An example, and a recent example, is one of the leading causes of the Soviet Union's collapse in the late 80s and early 90s was by the 1980s, the Soviet Union was literally drowning under its own bureaucracy. Its bureaucracy and its government had grown so big and so bloated and so inflexible that its own government literally choked the country to death. There's also a higher tax rate on all income brackets under a socialist system. The more socialist you get, even the poor start paying a lot of taxes. An example would be Nordic countries. There are Nordic countries that operate under socialistic systems, although they are still market economies, but they are socialistic in the sense that the tax rates are extremely high. Basic needs are met. Transportation is taken care of, housing is taken care of, healthcare is taken care of, police, fire, and military is taken care of. But the citizenry of a lot of Nordic countries do not have a lot of discretionary income, which means, yes, their housing is taken care of, and so is their health insurance, and their police, and their fire, but going out with their friends to a restaurant on a weekend is considered a luxury because a lot of people can't afford to, because taxes have taken all their money. And that's where you really have to make the distinction of what is more important to you. The flexibility to live the life that you want on the outside chance that maybe you won't be able to take care of your health coverage, or maybe you'll get hit with some kind of crazy expense in the future, maybe. Or you get that security aspect and then you don't get to go out and have fun on weekends. So we'll talk about that in just a second. In socialistic systems, choice is also limited for certain goods and services, and that's because the government provides them. If the government does not want to provide a specific good or service, you don't get access to it. Economic stagnation also affects everyone equally. And socialist countries have a tendency to slip into economic stagnation. The Soviet Union, Venezuela, Cuba, they've all stagnated at some point in time. Venezuela's collapsing. On top of that, certain types of private property are discouraged as unnecessary or unfair excesses. So let's say that you lived in a socialistic society and public transportation was taken care of. If you owned a car, that would be shunned by the general public. Because why do you need a car when the government provides transportation for you? What, do you think you're special? That's the general feeling.
That's like you. Like you.
Yeah, like you.
So that's like a branch of government other than Republican and Democrat.
Well, Republican and Democrat are political parties. Socialism and capitalism are ideologies. They're economic models.
Do you run country though? So like they run country though?
Countries will implement these systems. So like Venezuela is a socialist country. The Soviet Union is a socialist country. Cuba is a socialist country. The United States, France, and Germany are capitalist countries.
So is it right to say capitalism is the opposite of socialism?
The exact opposite. The exact opposite. Socialism and capitalism are very difficult to rectify. It's really hard to get socialism and capitalism to interact. The United States tries, but this is what's leading to a lot of our political problems. Because we do have socialistic systems operating within the United States. We do have public education, we do have taxpayer-funded police and fire and that kind of thing. So there are elements in American society that would be considered socialist. But think about what the big issue is every election cycle. People are always arguing about taxes. They don't want to be taxed, but they want more government programs. But you cannot get government programs without being taxed. And that is the key driver of the political bickering that we're seeing in the United States. So think about this. You're going to see this in the 2020 election. A lot of people I know, Bernie Sanders, Kamala Harris, Elizabeth Warren, they're all going to be campaigning on a program that they're proposing called Medicare for All. Basically, they want to take the Medicare system and expand it to every American in the country. Create a single-payer healthcare system. Who's going to pay for it? Medicare, as it currently stands, spends $600 billion a year just on what it stands for people that are out of work and retired. Now imagine applying that to every American, what that's going to cost. And who's going to pay for it? We are.
It looks like the medical system here is a bit off, because in the UK it's free. But certain things that, even though it's free, certain things that we get here, they do not get it free in the UK. You see what, even though the healthcare system, like you wouldn't be billed or anything to go see a doctor, but you see when you have a baby here, you get wig, you get all that, but they do not have wig as a wig. You know, wig gives mothers and infants food, but you have to, because my brother had his baby with his wife, they had to go get their own formula to the hospital. So even though it's free, those things are.
Yeah, and that's actually a really good example, and I'm glad that you specifically brought up the British NHS, because in order to understand like the differences between socialism and capitalism and like a collective security-based system and an individual freedom-based system, the healthcare system pretty much hits everything on the head in the fact that you can look at the healthcare system and see the differences. Everybody, it's no surprise, everybody knows in this room that the American healthcare system is pretty broken. Healthcare costs in the United States are ridiculously high. However, compare that to a system like in Canada or the UK, in which the healthcare system is provided by the government. The United States innovates more treatments than the UK and Canada, by far. The United States develops more drugs than Canada and the UK, by far. One of the reasons the United States has such an expensive healthcare system is because we are literally supplementing or financing the medical development for the rest of the world. Because while we do the research and development on new drugs because the pharmaceutical companies are chasing profit, the rest of the world is able to use what has already been developed, and because it's been developed, they are able to manufacture or kind of copy it for much lower prices. So our system innovates. Their system takes our innovations and applies it to their citizens.
Are we the only country that does that? Provides them?
Recently, yes. Recently, yes. So the vast majority of medical advances happen in the United States. Not in Norway, not in Canada, not in the UK. Also, another thing with the UK does have the National Healthcare Service, which is a government-financed healthcare service. People in the UK still buy private health insurance because they get better treatment under the private healthcare system than they do operating under the NHS. I have a student in my high school who's from the UK, and when he was last visiting family, he was, I think it was like a combination of dehydration and heat stroke. He collapsed while he was on the subway, and the treatment that he received in NHS, he used to sing the praises of the NHS, and then he had to go through the system. And he comes back to the States and says, I will never bitch about American healthcare again. Because even though he collapsed on the subway, he was in a waiting room in the emergency room for like 8 hours before a doctor saw him. So, same thing happens in Canada. People in Canada that get diagnosed with cancer come here for treatment.
Yeah, they always fly people in for cancer treatments and things like that.
It's because we have the most expensive healthcare system in the world, but we also have the best quality healthcare system in the world. Now, there are many ways that you can lower the cost in the United States. One of the big leading problems that I've been able to piece together for what leads to such astronomically high healthcare system or healthcare costs is the insurance companies. Because the insurance companies come in and they need to make profit, and the healthcare system needs to make profit, and the insurance companies are always trying to undercut what the hospitals get paid. So let's say if a hospital opens up and you're going to charge, I don't know, 10 cents a Band-Aid for your customers, right? The insurance companies will come and say, we'll only give you a penny. So as a hospital, you're not going to get paid. So how do you make sure that you recoup the loss of what you give when you gauze or drugs? You boost your costs. So the insurance company will come in, oh, we're only going to pay you 10%, and then you'll still make profit. But if you don't have health insurance, you have to pay the full amount. Although there are things currently working through Washington that might change that. Yes?
I believe one of them is on universal basic income, where like instead of taxing the people, they're going to tax companies like Amazon, who are becoming autonomous, who don't like use humans. So they make a lot of money, so they're going to have to put a higher income tax on those companies, and everybody in the United States is eventually going to get $1,000 a month. Everybody.
There have been a couple cities that have experimented, like recently, within the last 6 months, with universal basic income.
There's actually one that has 37 years doing this. It's Alaska. They have so they get paid every. Alaska gets paid about $2,000 a month because of their oils. So, but we're going into the generation where it's becoming technology. Technology is in oil. So they're gonna try to implement that into the whole United States.
Yeah, and it's a good question. I'm glad you mentioned automation too, because that is a good question. What happens when all the work becomes automated? What happens to us? And maybe we will become communistic. I mean, I honestly don't know. But there was an experiment that happened, I want to say in Portland, Oregon, with universal basic income and fell flat on its face because everybody that took part in the program stopped working.
Yeah, but you're still gonna need people for like coding and like learning how to.
That's true, and you're always going to find people that want to work. You will always find people that want to work. But you'll also find people that if they are guaranteed a basic income, they won't work. So it's a trade-off, and because you're dealing with individuals for a system that's collectivized. I mean, and that's really another tough part about collectivization, because if you're applying a one-size-fits-all policy to fit millions of people, well, how do you cater one policy to fit 300 million personalities? Right? Okay. Okay, so as for socialism, I like this. Socialists believe that government control of the economy is preferable in order to ensure a level of equality maintained throughout society. So the emphasis for socialism is placed on stability and security at the expense of freedom. A socialist would say something along the lines of, it's for the good of society that the government guides economic activity to ensure no one is left behind. A socialist would argue that individuals can only improve their lives if society as a whole improves. A socialist would say one person getting a higher standard of living than everybody else is not fair. Socialism is a collectivist system, which means that it's really well equipped to handle the needs of collectives, like health insurance, like fire, like police, like military, and all kinds of things. But it is very poorly equipped to handle the needs and wants of individuals. Because, like I said, you're trying to take a one-size-fits-all policy and apply it to 300 million people, which is really hard to do. I think I said in week 1 that liberty and security exist on a spectrum. The closer you are to one, the further you are from the other. You cannot have freedom and security exist at the same time. It's impossible. Some of the safest places on earth are prisons. Because in order to guarantee your safety, you have to give up your ability to function as an individual. Life is dangerous.
I heard that some homeless people, they when it's cold and things like that, they accidentally, purposely get in trouble so they could get no wages, so they get free food and free shelter.
Yeah, and that happens all the time. There was a guy in Montana who was diagnosed with a treatable illness that he wasn't able to afford the treatments for. So he grabbed a gun, he went into a bank, he robbed the teller. The teller gives him the money, he takes the money, puts it back on the counter, walks outside, and sat on the curb for the police to arrest him as a bank robber, because once he was in the prison system, he received the medical coverage that he needed to save his life. But he gave up his freedom in order to do it. But, give up your freedom, give up your life, and it's a tough decision to make. But the point that I'm trying to make is that liberty and security, the closer you are to one, the further you are from the other. There's no wrong place to be. I'm not sitting here and saying if you want to live in a safe society, that's wrong. I'm just saying that just recognize that the closer you get to security, you have to give up more of your liberty. This goes back to our week 1 lesson, week 2 lesson with Thomas Hobbes and the social contract. That in order to give up, in order to receive stability, you have to give up liberty and money. Economics is the same way on the economic spectrum. You've got the difference between equal opportunity, which is capitalism, and equal outcome, which is socialism. Socialism is on the security and equal outcome side of the spectrum. Capitalism is on the liberty and equal opportunity side of the spectrum. That's why capitalism is an individual system. Individual liberty, individual equal opportunity as compared to, or in contrast to, collectivist security. Does that make sense? Equal opportunity says that everyone has the same starting point, but not everybody will finish at the same place. Equal outcome says that takes into account that not everybody has the same starting point, but it tries to make it so that everybody does finish at the same place. Does that make sense? Now, keep in mind, this is all theory. Equal opportunity is something that's wonderful to shoot for. And equal outcome, some of you may argue that it's a wonderful thing to shoot for, but this is all theoretical. If equal opportunity says everybody has the same starting point, come on, we know that's not actually true. Because some people are more intelligent than others, some people are smarter, or I already said that, some people are funnier than others, some people are taller than others, some people, require only 2 hours of sleep instead of 12 hours of sleep. You get my drift. There's all these different factors that means that not everybody necessarily will have the same starting point in life. But equal opportunity says, essentially, you have the right to function as an individual. Find your own success. Does that make sense? And then the socialistic side says, well, not everyone comes from the same place. So we have to try to level the playing field. But what that usually means is, if equal outcome is what is preferable, social-wise, what that means is that successful people are gradually held down in order to keep them from overtaking the less successful people. Because consider this, if you've got a group of people and they're all rising economically, right? They're going to rise at different paces. Now there's a couple things that there's only one of two ways that you can equalize the playing field economically. You can raise those that are struggling up, or you can bring those that are successful down. But it's a hell of a lot easier to drag people down than it is to raise people up. Just like construction in life. I mean, it takes weeks, if not months, to build a building, 10 seconds to tear it down. And people like taking the easy route, which is why under socialist systems, successful people have a tendency to be pulled down through higher taxation, more regulation, that kind of thing. The concept of utopia, the concept of socialism, came from this particular individual. And there's another guy that we're going to look at as well. Before we continue, does anybody have any questions about the differences between socialism and capitalism? Any thoughts? Yes?
A question. So, is it right to say maybe Nigeria is a capitalist country? Because it's definitely, I don't think it's a socialist country.
I know very little of Nigeria. Do they operate under markets, or does the government provide basic services, or?
No. They do provide basic services for Ghana, yes, but it's not like the US. So I think it's in between.
Yeah, I honestly don't know. I'd have to look into that. And I'm sorry I couldn't answer your question.
It's all right.
I want to say that most countries in the world operate under markets, which means they're more capitalistic than anything. I mean, even China is becoming more capitalist than anything, and they still claim to be a communist country. They're not. And neither is Vietnam, by the way. Vietnam is like, yeah, we're a communist country. No, you're not. Any other questions, clarifications, thoughts? Somebody tell me I'm wrong. Okay, what is a utopia?
The perfect society.
The perfect society, that's what a utopia is. The concept of utopia is the idea of a perfect society. Charles Fourier was the guy that came up with the concept of utopia. He lived from 1772 to 1837. He was a salesman. He did not like the competitive nature of sales. One of my students from a previous class joked that it's because he was probably a bad salesman. But he was also a writer, and in his spare time he wrote short stories and kind of planned these little communities out that he believed should be held together by love. He was planning these communities, these little collective groups, kind of like these little hamlets that would be off in the woods somewhere, where people would work for the betterment of their society and not for their own selfish individual gains. And that's what he planned. And he says that if you can create a society like this, where everybody works for each other instead of for themselves, you can create utopia. Charles Fourier was also followed up by this guy, a man named Robert Owen, who lived from 1771 to 1858. Now, unlike Fourier, Robert Owen was a successful businessman. This man was very wealthy. So wealthy, he ended up buying towns. This is part of the town that he owned in Scotland called New Lanark. This is the workers' barracks over here. New Lanark was a mill town. It was a cotton mill, and then the community had popped up around the cotton mill. When Robert Owen took it over, wages were very low, work hours were extremely high, and there was poverty all over the place. It was really, really rough living. So Robert Owen bought the mill town, and he transformed it, kind of creating his own version of utopia. He raised wages, he reduced working hours from 17 hours a day to 10 hours a day, and he sold his goods at fair prices. He also provided for the education of his workers' children, and in 1816 he ended up opening his own private school for the children of his employees. And people from all over England and Scotland were sending their kids to him with little letters, "Dear Mr. Owen, I can't afford education for my son or my daughter, please educate them." And Robert Owen never turned them away, because he had the money in order to pay for this. And he still managed to make a profit. So with the success of New Lanark and the writings of Charles Fourier, people began planning their own form of utopia. And utopian societies began popping up all over the world. People would kind of go off into some far corner, go out into the boonies and try to form their own community. Worldwide. And people began trying to implement their own version of utopia as kind of like these small-scale experiments that if they worked, they would hope would go global. But the vast majority of these communities faced crippling economic and political difficulties early on. Most of them failed within the first 2 or 3 years. And then they would collapse. With the success of New Lanark, Robert Owen tried again with a town called New Harmony in Indiana. This is what it was planned to be, kind of like this structure, this gigantic structure that would be a combination of apartments that would almost create like an outer wall, and then the interior of it was going to be, common areas, a marketplace, and the factory where everybody would work. Robert Owen bought this town in 1825. Now, in 1825, the most capitalistic country in the world was the United States. So Robert Owen had the mindset that if he could make his New Lanark model work in the United States, it could work anywhere. So that's why he bought New Harmony. And it was supposed to be his American version of New Lanark. But it very quickly became overcrowded and unruly, because the only people that moved into New Harmony to work were those who were unskilled labor, people that did not have marketable skills. Anybody that did have marketable skills, people that were supervisors, people that were skilled labor, they chased higher wages because they were able to get paid more. So it quickly became overcrowded and unruly. There was frequent conflict over the usage of land and space. People were arguing over what to use the land for, and it never achieved self-sufficiency. It was not able to make a profit. It was barely able to manufacture really anything. And that's because it lacked skilled labor and supervision to make the whole thing work. And it accrued crippling financial debt because it just couldn't pay its bills. Funnily enough, New Harmony only survived for as long as it did because of donations from the ultra-rich, which I think is really ironic that socialism says that being rich is bad. But this model of socialism only existed because rich people paid for it. It transitioned away from socialism in 1828 and dissolved completely in 1829. It was a dismal failure. If this was the proposal of New Harmony, that was the reality. That's what they managed to build.
Wow. But back then it was like, that was
Now, even back then, this was a pile of crap. All right. Let's talk about some epic bearded men. Who are these folks? Anybody recognize any of them?
This one, Marx.
This one?
Yeah, but I can't see shit.
That's Trump and his
I'm confused.
big
This one's Karl Marx.
Oh, that one?
This was Karl Marx. I know, they both have these big shaggy beards. This is his buddy Friedrich Engels. Okay. Another ism. You don't have to write it down because you get the lecture notes next week. Communism is a political theory derived from Karl Marx, advocating class war and leading to a society in which all property is publicly owned and each person works and is paid according to their abilities and needs. Marxism in a nutshell, I'm actually going to go back to this picture. Marx believed that the problems facing society in the 19th century, you know, the wealth inequality, the poverty, the disease, was capitalism's fault. Essentially took all the problems of the 19th century, put it in a box, wrapped it in a bow, dropped it at the feet of capitalism and said, this is your fault. Marx argued that capitalism divides people into two systems, or two classes. The bourgeoisie, which are the people who own the means of production, the factory owners, the bosses, that kind of thing, the millionaires, and the proletariat. The proletariat being the working class that only has their labor to sell. Marx then argued that the interaction between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat was one of exploitation. The proletariat were ruthlessly exploited by the bourgeoisie in order to turn a profit. Yes?
So is that what we had with bougie from?
That's where you get the term bougie. Yep.
Okay.
Someone walks in and they're all in their hoity-toity, their nice clothes. Oh, you're so bougie. I thought I saw a hand go up. Marx looked at economics as a zero-sum game. If Marx saw a rich person and a poor person, Marx would come to the conclusion that the only reason the rich person got rich was because he took money from the poor person. That was it. Marx said that if someone is winning, that means that someone is losing. That was his outlook on life. So Marx believed that the bourgeoisie ruthlessly exploited the proletariat in order to turn a profit. Now, as for the role of government and the state in Marx's view, Marx believed that the government in general and the courts specifically were created and owned by the bourgeoisie in order to keep the proletariat oppressed. So Marx did not like the government. He essentially argued that the government and the courts made sure that the deck was stacked against the proletariat so the proletariat would not have access to legal recourse through the justice system. He then also said that music, art, and literature was created as a distraction for the proletariat. That it was designed to placate the proletariat, keep them in servitude, because if they're distracting themselves with art, literature, television, radio, whatever, you can apply this to modern day. If you get distracted with the internet, then you're not going to pay attention to the person that's oppressing you, because you can get distracted. And Marx said that music, art, and literature were all part of this distraction, this grand conspiracy by the bourgeoisie in order to keep the proletariat enslaved.
That's like what people say now with like some political event is going on and then just a big media thing goes on, so they say, oh, they're just distracting you from what's going on politically.
Yeah, it's called wagging the dog.
Wagging what?
Wagging the dog. Yeah, it's kind of this joke in the political. It's like why it's this joke in political spheres. Why does a dog wag his tail? Because the dog is smarter than a tail. What happens when the tail is smarter than the dog? The tail wags the dog. So it's saying that when there's something political happening that's making a politician look really, really bad, they'll create this media firestorm somewhere else to distract everybody else's attention to that firestorm.
Wasn't that why the movie started? During the war or something like that, to distract people about like what was going on in the war, things like that?
Not necessarily during the war, but during the Great Depression.
Like Hollywood and stuff, right?
Yep. So, you know, Walt Disney, for example, Snow White, that all came out during the Depression. Because the movies were designed to distract people from
Make
the...
them laugh and things like that.
Now, it's not like the movies were created in order to distract people. It says that people were looking for a distraction and Hollywood answered the demand. It's...
Well, it really is like that then.
Well, movies were big in the 1920s as well, when the economy was doing fantastic. But when the economy crashed during the Great Depression, people were looking for a distraction.
Yeah, no,
And
like
they
not
went to
even
the
in a
Hollywood
bad way, but even if it's still for that, like for distraction.
Yeah,
Not bad
people
distraction.
crave distraction when bad shit happens. No, it's human nature. If something really bad is happening to you, you want to be distracted with something else. Because you don't want to focus on the bad thing that's happening to you.
You want to drink, you want to do something else.
And alcohol, alcohol was made legal again during the Great Depression. So alcoholism was made illegal by Woodrow Wilson, and then when the Depression hit, FDR comes in and says, we should repeal this constitutional amendment because right now people want to go out and get drunk. Because they're not working. So that's why Prohibition was repealed, because the economy collapsed. Marx also applied that to religion, by the way. He says that he called religion an opiate of the masses, opium being a painkiller. He argued that religion keeps workers focused on a hypothetical realm rather than reflecting on their current misery. Because the general rule of thumb, Marx was like, okay, the working class being ruthlessly exploited, they're keeping their heads down because they want to go to heaven when they die. And then Marx was like, well, what if heaven's not real? You've allowed yourself to be oppressed with the dream that you'll attain something that may not exist. So that's why he called religion the opiate of the masses. Now, I kind of find this funny that Marx was so fervent about how, like, the bourgeoisie were exploiting the proletariat and the zero-sum game. And the reason I say it's funny is because Marx was a freeloader. Friedrich Engels owned a factory and made a ton of money, and Marx lived off of Friedrich Engels. Marx did not work. He was not a successful author while he was alive. He didn't start selling copies of Communist Manifesto and Capital until after he died.
After he died, something did after he died.
The book became a success after Marx died. So, have you ever heard of the book or the movie Girl with the Dragon Tattoo? Yeah, the author who wrote that is dead. He wrote that book and had it published, put it in his will that he wanted it published after he had died, so that his family could get the profits, not him. So he wrote it years ago, and it's only now become big. Same thing kind of happened with Capital, Das Kapital, and with the Communist Manifesto. Marx wrote it, he sold a couple copies while he was alive, and then it didn't become a big success until after he had died. Okay. Marx is responsible for writing two very famous works on economics. The first one is called Das Kapital, which just means capitalism, or talks about capital. No, I'm sorry. The title means capital, and it talks about capitalism. Capital is a scathing criticism of capitalism, and it's his most influential work, or I should say it's his most thorough work. It's the biggest book that he wrote, but it's not the most famous one. The most famous book that he wrote is called Communist Manifesto, but Communist Manifesto was designed to be like an addendum to Capital, where it's like, here's Capital, this is all I write in my theory, but if you don't have time to read this big book, here's a smaller version. And that's what the Communist Manifesto was about. So Communist Manifesto was an addendum to Das Kapital, and in it, Marx and Engels aligned themselves with the communist movement. Now this is something that I want to clarify. Marx did not invent communism, just like Adam Smith did not invent capitalism, or Thomas Hobbes did not invent the social contract. The names are associated with these ideas because the people whose names are associated with the ideas are the ones who defined it. Karl Marx didn't invent communism, he defined it. Adam Smith did not invent capitalism, he defined it. And that's why we give Karl Marx credit for communism. Because Marxism was his definition of communism. But in Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels aligned themselves with the communist movement, which was kind of going on all over the place. And in Communist Manifesto, Marx argued that capitalism is doomed to fail due to a combination of overproduction, underconsumption, and diminishing profits. When the Great Depression hit in 1929, the stock market crashed in 29, the Great Depression didn't hit until 1930 and 1931. But when the Great Depression hit, all the communists were like, it's in the book, this is it. Diminishing returns, underconsumption, diminishing profits, overproduction. the economy's collapsing, it's time to bring in the world revolution. And then the economy recovered.
What is the Great Depression?
We'll talk about it in more detail in a future class, but it was a financial crisis that made what happened in 2008 look like just a little firecracker. According to Marx, the communist endgame would be that eventually the proletariat would get so tired of being oppressed and exploited by the bourgeoisie that they would rebel against the bourgeoisie in general and against capitalism specifically. And that, I believe he said something along the lines of, the only thing the proles have to lose is their chains. So the proletariat would eventually rebel against capitalism, and then according to Marx, once the proletariat rebelled, they would seize control of all government authority and form what he called a dictatorship of the proletariat, which is a collective dictatorship. All of the working class would come together and take over the country, take over an entire system and run the whole thing, and then use their newfound government power in order to seize control of all of the means of production and then distribute the means of production equitably to everybody. Marx argued that eventually, once all the means of production had been equitably distributed to the members of a society, then the government would no longer be necessary, and that government would crumble. And what would be left behind would be a perfectly fair, perfectly just, and perfectly humane society. A utopia. And that's the end game of communism, is that you have revolution, dictatorship of the proletariat, and then pure communism. The biggest flaw that Marx never took into account when he was making this is the greed of individuals. Because if you have absolute power, how many people do you know would be willing to give that up? So once the dictatorship of the proletariat has been established historically, no communist or communistic society has ever been able to transition beyond the dictatorship of the proletariat. Because once you concentrate all of the power into the hands of a very specific group of people, they are unwilling to give it up. Communism, slavery, it doesn't matter. When you take a lot of power and give it to a very few group of people, they're going to abuse their power. And that's why in certain parts, like during the Soviet Union, communism was akin to slavery for many, many people. Because the government forced them into labor camps in order to make the society work. But we'll talk about that in a future class. Okay, I did this little quick and easy comparison between capitalism, socialism, and communism, and I divided it up into four main categories. How they feel about ownership, how they feel about profits, how they feel about the distribution of goods and services, and how they feel about the role of the state. We'll talk about capitalism. Capitalism, as it comes to ownership, capitalists believe that private ownership of goods and the means of production is preferable. Everybody owns what they are able to own, and then they buy and sell what they need or what they want. So capitalism works when you accept that private property is a thing. As for profits, capitalism considers profit as the same thing as property. That if you make money, that money becomes your property. If you make profit, that profit becomes your property. So a capitalist argues that, that profits are the property of business owners to do with as they see fit. But I have to add, but it's still subjected to natural market forces. Because if you own a company and you make all of the profits and you don't pay your employees, you're not going to have any more employees, and you're not going to have a business. So if you want to keep the party going, you're still going to have to spend money on things based on market force. Distribution of goods and services. Capitalism takes three main principles. The concept of supply and demand. Goods and services are distributed based on supply and demand. If you have a thing and someone wants a thing and is willing to pay you what you want for the thing, supply and demand would allow that transaction to occur. I want a gold-plated Maserati. I'm not going to get a gold-plated Maserati. Voluntary exchange is the second one. Voluntary exchange essentially says that you should not be forced to buy something that you don't want to buy, and that you should not be forced to sell something that you don't want to sell. Connect this to modern history to give you guys a little bit of, to see how this works out in modern society. One of the main arguments about Obamacare when it was passed in 2009 was the individual mandate. A lot of people that came out against Obamacare didn't actually really give a crap about the system itself and how it was going to try to distribute private health insurance. They did care about the fact that the government was coming in and saying, you have to buy health insurance or we punish you. And that's why Obamacare was so unpopular. It's not that people didn't like Obamacare because it was passed by Obama, although there were people that did think that. But most of the arguments against Obamacare was the individual mandate. And the individual mandate says, you must buy health insurance, and if you don't, we will tax you. We will punish you for it. Because that's essentially the government coming in and saying, if you don't buy this, whether you want to buy it or not, we will punish you. And that kind of takes away the idea of voluntary exchange. It's not voluntary if someone's telling you to do it. Make sense? And then finally, distribution of goods and services under capitalist system would be normal market forces. Things come in and out of vogue. People buy what's popular and that kind of thing. As for the role of the state, capitalists believe that the government should be no more than a referee at best, or I'm sorry, no more than a referee at worst, or hands off most, if not all of the time. That the government should not interfere with the economy at all. There are people, you would consider those people to be part of what's called laissez-faire capitalism. Laissez-faire capitalism is government stays completely out of the economy altogether, and then the economy just runs itself. Okay, as for socialism, socialism argues that ownership depends. Major industries would be owned by the state. Transportation companies, health coverage companies, fire departments, all of this would be owned by the state. But then the small businesses would be owned privately. And there would be some private property. Socialistic systems are not opposed to the idea of private property, it just depends on what. So in a socialist system, your clothes are your clothes. But you're going to be getting the same kind of health coverage that everybody else is getting. You wouldn't be able to go out and buy your own health plan. That's what we're talking about. In terms of profits under a socialist system, the profits from small firms go to their respective owners after being taxed, but the profits from large firms go to the government. Distribution of goods and services. Non-essentials are left to natural market forces. Cell phones, clothing, food, that kind of thing. But I'm talking like designer food, like restaurants. But the essentials, transportation, health insurance, food for survival, housing, all of that is distributed by government planning in a socialist system. And then finally, the role of the state in a socialist system. For small industries, the government runs as a referee. For big businesses, the government is the central planner. And then for communism, I had to separate it between theory and reality, just so you can kind of give some historical, what's the word I'm looking for? Just to give you like an idea of how theory and reality don't always line up historically. So in terms of ownership, communism says that the collective ownership, or that there would be collective ownership of all the means of production. That everybody in society as a whole would own everything collectively. But in reality, it was total state ownership of the goods and the means of production. Which means that cell phone in your pocket isn't your cell phone, it's our cell phone, but technically it's the government's cell phone. That's how it operated under a communist system. Some of you are pretty confused. Yeah, in a communist system, they push the idea of collective ownership, which is, that isn't your cell phone, that's our cell phone, right? And that's where it ends. That was the theory. Well, the phone that you bought, you may have bought it, but it still technically owns it. It belongs to everybody else. This is all theory, and I'm using a reductio ad absurdum, I'm using a fallacy in order to kind of explain this and simplify this as much as I can. I'm using a purposely absurd example just to simplify it. So, cell phones.
Like
no one gives a shit about cell phones.
Like cable boxes?
Yeah. Well, the cable box is a property of the company.
Right.
But under a communist system, everything belongs to everybody. So, in theory, under a communist system, I could start rummaging through her bag and looking for our lipstick. Not her lipstick, not my lipstick, but our lipstick.
Share.
Yes. Sharing is caring by force. That's the theory. In reality, everything that you have in your possession is technically the property of the government, and the government is just letting you use it. Does that make sense?
Even though you bought it with your own money,
Even if you're.
Yeah, your money, the sugar that you have in your pantry is technically not yours.
Your house. Like.
Your house, your apartment, none of that would be yours.
Well,
And
then they should pay for our rent and pay for everything.
Well, in a communist system, you would be assigned housing based on what's available. You wouldn't pay for it. I mean, this happened in the Soviet Union. People were put in housing communities that were built by the government. Thing is, though, the government couldn't build enough to keep up with the growing population. So if you were put in government housing in the Soviet Union, you'd be sharing your apartment with multiple families.
Yeah.
And then if you had a cup of sugar and your neighbor had 2 cups of sugar, your neighbor would probably go to prison.
What?
yes,
Yeah,
that's true.
because they've got more than you do, and that's not fair.
Oh, so it has to be equal.
Yeah,
That's crazy.
right. So that's where I'm talking about how the theory doesn't line up to the reality. Because in theory, everybody owns everything. But in reality, in a communist system, the government owns everything. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So they could walk into your house and do anything.
And they did, all the time. It still happens. Happens in North Korea, happens in Cuba. Yes.
What about people that work for the government?
They would get special privileges because they worked for the government.
Like the Secret Service, like they know everything about you and they can just like one day come in your house.
In Iron Curtain era East Germany, 1 out of every 3 people was a government informant. Which means if you sat down with your family and there were 3 people there, 1 of them was spying on you for the government. So there was, you know how I said, talking about government housing in the Soviet Union? Because housing units were always in short supply, what you would have was people began ratting out their neighbors just so they could get their neighbors arrested, and then as a reward for ratting their neighbor out for being a criminal of the state, that apartment building would be rewarded to the people that ratted them out. So let's say that you were living in an apartment with like 3 other families, and then your neighbor had a nice corner apartment and
You wanted it. Yeah.
and you wanted it.
Yeah.
So you go up to the commissar and say, hey, my neighbor Joe, borrowed a cup of sugar from me and then never gave it back.
Yeah.
And the commissar would go arrest them, take them off to the labor camp, and you'd get their apartment. Until someone ratted you out.
Yeah.
Exactly.
That's just like the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, exactly what it is.
Yeah, when we talk about the Russian Revolution, you're going to be able to draw a lot of parallels between the Russian Revolution and the French Revolution, because they used the same thing. They even implemented their own policies of terror. Kill all the bad people and you can bring in utopia. French Revolution, Russian Revolution was the same thing. The Russian Revolution killed 10 million people. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Okay, as for profits, under a communist system, all profits, in theory, would be shared by the collective, but in reality, all profits belong to the state. Distribution of goods and services, the theory from Marx is from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs, which is basically a fancy way of saying you work as hard as you can for the benefit of society, and you take only what you need to survive. That's the Marxist theory. In reality, the central government did all of the planning.
Professor,
Yes?
so I understand something. Even though you've been working so hard for your money, it still does not belong to you. Is that what you're saying?
Pretty much. Or it doesn't matter what job you do or how hard you work, you get paid just as much as everybody else.
Yeah, a doctor gets paid the same as janitors, like everybody gets paid the same, so there's no competition. So
Exactly.
you just do your job out of the love for your.
And then another problem that happened in the Soviet Union is, like you said, for the example, and this is always used as the example, that doctors made as much as janitors. Well, if that's the case, why wouldn't everybody in the Soviet Union become janitors? Or why would somebody want to go through all of the work to become a doctor? It's because the government would determine what you would become.
Yeah.
Which meant depending on your school scores, you would have a meeting with a commissar that would sit down with you and say, you're going to become a doctor. And you'd be like, well, I want to be an engineer. They'll be like, well, tough shit, you're going to be a doctor. And they put you through medical school. Regardless of what you wanted to do or not.
I guess because of the IQ test,
Yeah,
like
like
they
it's
see
a
what
movie, there's a movie like
you
that.
are high, like that football.
Yep, based on what
player.
your scores were in school. I want to be an engineer. Oh, well, your math scores are really bad. Or even if your math scores were fantastic and your biology scores were awful, You'd still be a doctor if the state needed more doctors. Even if you were the perfect person to be an engineer, Soviet Union didn't care. You were put in the job that they determined for you. There was very little flexibility within that system. So you couldn't determine what you wanted to do. Yeah, because there was no freedom. Because the Soviet Union was all built on the idea of collective security. Provide security, make sure everybody has a job and everybody has a roof over their head. But in order to do that, you have to take away everybody's freedom. Because consider this, if you have the freedom to make your own decisions based on what career you want to pursue, you are not guaranteed employment. Because maybe you're going into a field that you really want to be in, but it's oversaturated, or no one's hiring, or your skills aren't good enough, you know, that kind of thing. Freedom versus security, you can't have both. Right, starting to piece this together, right? This is something that we're going to constantly revisit like pretty much for the rest of the class. So this is one of the super important lessons. So yeah, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, distribution of goods and services in reality was the central government planning. In terms of the role of the state, Marx argued that eventually in the communist utopia there would be no government. Government would not be necessary. But in reality, every communist state has had a totalitarian government, which means the government is the supreme god emperor of the universe. They rule everything. All right, any questions about that so far? Does anybody need any clarification on this stuff?
Yeah, I do.
Sure.
I just get the advice. You working and somebody else claiming, you know, somebody else claiming.
Keep in mind, I was just arguing theory.
But so that means that the don't change the people in power. It's like they'll be there forever. Really?
Pretty much.
Gosh, there.
The way that in the Soviet Union people came in and out of government positions is they either retired or they were killed.
Wow.
Especially in the Politburo, and especially under Joseph Stalin.
And nobody came overthrow them like the revolution or anything. That's what
No, because the people didn't have the ability to fight back. So there were multiple attempted uprisings in places the Soviet Union controlled. So like there was an uprising in the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia. There was an uprising in Poland. And every time there was an uprising, the Soviet Union would send the military in and put it down.
It's because someone was always like it.
I had a very, very close friend of the family. He died several years ago, but he lived in Poland during the Iron Curtain years, and Poland had mandatory military service. So we had to do 2 years in the Polish army. And he, you know, this is Iron Curtain years. He's under the rule of the Soviet Union while he was drilling in the Polish army. And every time a Russian officer or a Russian commissar would come to his base for an inspection, all of the soldiers would have all of their ammunition taken away. Because the commissar knew that if there was a Polish soldier that was armed, that soldier probably would have shot the commissar. Because they hated the Russians. But that's how the Soviet Union kept everything under control.
So whose idea is the Soviet Union? Whose idea?
It was all technically under Marx's theory.
No, Marx is not nice.
Well, Marx, from what I understand from the political philosophers that I know of, Marx is the only one that advocates for genocide. Because Marx essentially said the only way to bring in a utopia is you have to kill the bourgeoisie. He advocated class war. Kill the rich, take their stuff. That's Marx's theory. So really scary thought that if you were to put Stalin and Hitler in a room, and they didn't talk about race, Hitler and Stalin would agree on most things. The only thing that Hitler and Stalin really didn't agree on much was who to kill. Stalin said, kill the rich people. Hitler said, kill the Jews.
Yeah. Wow.
And that's what they didn't agree on. But they were the same system. Hitler provided transportation for the people. We took a Volkswagen. Volkswagen was created by the Nazis in order to provide a car for common people that they could afford. The highway system was built, the healthcare system was built. The Soviet Union, Nazi Germany all came in with the same idea. Give us power, we will provide your health insurance, or we will provide your health care, we will provide your transportation, we will protect you, and the only thing we require in exchange is your blind obedience. And that was it. Give up your freedom and we will take care of you. And that's what the Nazis and the communists said. And people believed it. Only when they realized once they had given up their freedom, they realized too late what that meant. It's actually coming out of Venezuela now. Because you know Venezuela voted for a socialist government, right? Do they look like they're happy? I mean, they're being fired upon by their own government. Maduro, didn't he like lose an election and he's like, oh, the election's not legitimate?
Yeah, he said.
Yeah.
And now he's not stepping down?
Yeah.
Like Colombia sent 4 trucks of supplies to help people in Venezuela who were starving to death. He set the shit on fire. This is a quote that came out of Eastern Europe during the Cold War, but now it's kind of reasserting itself in common speech because of what's happening in Venezuela. You can vote your way into socialism, but you have to shoot your way out.
Well, wait, Professor,
Yes.
is that the same thing happening in North Korea?
North Korea, do you really think the North Koreans love their government? The only reason the North Koreans haven't killed Kim Jong-un is because they have no weapons.
It's still there, right? Or-
Communism and socialism are the same system, except communism is a more extreme form.
But it's still in the world right now, like there's still people.
Keep in mind, there's never ever been anything that even closely resembles Marxist communism, because there's never been a system that dissolved its government and tried to usher in utopia. But countries still claim to be communist. The Soviet Union claimed to be communist. And that was the closest we ever came to pure communism. If Stalin decided to, kill himself and everybody in the government and not replace them with anything, the Soviet Union would have tried to transition into that utopia stage, but it probably wouldn't have lasted more than 5 minutes. And that's just because of human nature. People have a tendency to pursue what they want to pursue. Human beings are naturally greedy. So North Korea claims to be communist, Cuba claims to be communist, Vietnam claims to be communist, China claims to be communist, Russia claimed to be communist. So there have been quote-unquote self-appointed communist governments all over the place. But there are also socialist systems all over the place as well. And socialism and communism is the same theory, just communism is a more extreme form of it. Does that make sense? Because both socialism and communism are collective, and then capitalism is individualistic. Now, where you fall on the spectrum, I mean, I'm not judging anybody. It's okay. If you want to be a Marxist, you can be a Marxist. I'm not going to judge you. But just know that for each system, there's a trade-off. Okay, socialism is the path to achieve the communist endgame. And those aren't my words. That's Lenin. Vladimir Lenin argued that socialism is a path to the communist utopia. And that's what separates socialists from communists, is that socialists advocate for gradual change through representative government and through the democratic process. Socialists play the long game. You may hear it coming up in the next election, something called creeping socialism. That's what it's called. Socialism moves slowly. We want this program. If we don't get it, the next generation will push for it. If they don't get it, the next generation will push for it. Obamacare was called creeping socialism. And I'll explain why. Obamacare was not Obama's idea. Obamacare came out of Mitt Romney's version, called Romneycare. But that wasn't Romney's idea. Romney got that idea from Hillary Clinton. It was called Hillary-Care. But Hillary Clinton didn't get that idea. She got it from Nixon-Care. Because Nixon tried to get that system put in place in the 1970s. But Nixon didn't get that idea himself either. He got it from Lyndon Johnson under the Great Society programs. But Johnson didn't get that idea either. That came out of the New Deal. So Obamacare, the argument and the fight for Obamacare started in the 1940s. And it took 60 years to get put in place. But every generation of politician pursued the same policy. And that's an example of creeping socialism.
But Obama got the credit for it.
Obama got the credit for it because he's the one that got it passed. And that's why it's called creeping socialism, because the mentality of socialists is if we can't get it now, we'll push for it later. Make sense?
You think communism will creep itself?
Communism is, by definition, not creeping, because communism advocates for violent overthrow of the government, rapid change. Marx argued that you don't have time to waste, you're being oppressed now, fight now. And that's what separates socialism from communism. Communism and capitalism are related in their approach to their goals. Capitalism and communism are short-term goals. Capitalism says pursue freedom right now, in the moment, make money. Communism says overthrow the system right now, free yourself. Socialism plays the long game. And that's what separates socialism from communism. Because communism is very in your face. We're going to implement a communist revolution and we're going to do it violently and we're going to overthrow you and you're either with us or you're against us. Socialism is like, hey, check out this policy. Do you like it? I'll ask you again in 10 years.
So when you went to economic and the building economy, which was more? You have, what do you think? You think it's good?
Oh, you don't want to ask me that question. Do you really want me to answer that question? I should pause the camera. My opinion of Obamacare, I think Obama's heart was in the right place. I think that he really wanted to kind of break the stalemate of our broken healthcare system, but I think he went about it the wrong way. It's one of those things, when I look at Obamacare, it was a good idea. No, it wasn't even that. It was a good intention, poor idea, poor execution. But keep in mind, I'm the free market guy. I don't like the government telling me what I can and can't buy, or what I have to buy. Because I'm a very independent person. Don't believe me? Ask my parents.
So what?
Go clean your room. No.
So what was their argument behind them telling us what to do if we're like a free whatever?
The individual mandate was actually put in place because of Republicans. Strangely enough, which Republicans are like, oh yeah, we love capitalism, except this. This is why I said in week 1 I am a begrudging Republican. The way Obamacare system was supposed to work, okay, consider health costs. Which demographic of people, and I'm talking age group, are more expensive to cover healthcare-wise? Elderly people, because they have more health problems, because they're reaching the end of their lives and their health begins to falter. So because they are reaching, they're elderly and they have more healthcare problems, they are more expensive to take care of because they put a higher demand on the healthcare system. The individual mandate was designed to offset that. Because as people age and contract more health problems, that's when they have a higher tendency to buy into health insurance. But health insurance also has to take that into account. That's why when you're really, really young, your health insurance costs are pretty low. Because you're young, you're healthy, and the insurance companies are like, you're never going to use it. So young people are looked at as a cash cow, so that they can funnel money to the elderly, which costs a lot more. So the Obamacare individual mandate had that same thing in mind. That if we force young people to buy into the system, there will be enough money to pay for the elderly that collects from the system. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So it's essentially wealth redistribution, taking money out of the young in order to pay for the elderly.
Then it should be
Social Security works the same way.
It should be Obamacare. They should change the name to Obamacare for the old or for the age or something.
But then imagine that you implemented that system just for the elderly. How are you going to pay for it?
They should not pay when they were younger. But
Yeah, but if you're implementing it now, are you going to invent a time machine and say pay for it now? So you really can't. You're kind of stuck in the moment. Social Security works the exact same way. That's why anybody who has a job is paying into Social Security now, but you don't collect it until you're 65.
And if you collect.
Our generation will probably not collect Social Security. The system will probably implode under the weight of the baby boomers. Because the baby boomers outnumber our generation by like 2 to 1. Well, you had the post-World War II boom, all the soldiers came home. They're like, hey honey, I almost got shot, let's make babies. And there was this huge population surge in the 50s and 60s, and then they grew up and they're like, I don't want kids. So, yeah, boomers outnumber us like 2 to 1. So, while they collect Social Security, we're paying into it, which means they are quite literally draining the system dry. Mitt Romney got into a lot of trouble by calling the Social Security system a Ponzi scheme. It's not a Ponzi scheme, it's a pyramid scheme. So really, Mitt Romney got in trouble for using the wrong word. The Social Security system is not a Ponzi scheme, but it is a pyramid scheme. In order to keep it going, you will need more people paying into it than people collecting from it. Which is another thing that draws into the immigration debate in the United States. Because as we talked about last class, the population growth in the United States has slowed down. White Americans, their population is actually shrinking. So the government is like, in order to keep the social services going, we need to import more people that will pay into the system. See how everything is connected? These are not these, each issue that we're arguing about, we're always arguing about it as if it's like this standalone issue, but it's not. Everything in politics is a web. Everything is connected to itself. I mean, the abortion debate, for example, you cannot solve the crisis of abortion without education reforms, healthcare reforms, prison care system reforms. You can't fix abortion unless you fix 50 different things. So it's a web. Wow, we got off on a big-ass tangent. All right, so socialists advocate for gradual change through representative government in order to nudge society toward communism. Communists, however, advocate for violent overthrow. They advocate for the proletariat to seize government control and then use their dictatorship of the proletariat to confiscate the means of production. So the comparisons, we already hit on this. Both communism and socialism rely on government control in order to achieve its goal, and both of them are hostile to varying degrees of private property. Communism says there is no private property. Socialism says you can have some. Both also place the good of the community above the good of the individual, which we'll see when these systems were implemented in the 20th century, it had disastrous effects. Because when the collective means everything, the individual means nothing. I'm going to use Hitler as an example because I'm always using Hitler as an example. Hitler was a collectivist. What did he want? Now, he wanted global control, and he wanted to control everything and kill everybody. But he wanted that because he was working on what he believed for the best interest of the Aryan race, for the Germans. So what he believed is that to Adolf Hitler, his collective was German people. And that everything outside of that group was an obstacle to the thriving of the German race. So that's why Hitler advocated for genocide. That's why Hitler wanted global domination, because he was trying to make the world a utopia, a paradise for Germans. Collectivism. And anybody that stepped out of line died. Because when the collective means everything, it doesn't matter if you have a second opinion, because all that matters is the survival and the thriving of the Aryan race, which means if you step out of line, you're just one corpse. What do I care? Stalin made a famous quote about it. Stalin said, the death of one is a tragedy, but the death of a million is a statistic. And that's because people were like, why are you killing so many people? And Stalin's like, I'm killing enemies for the revolution. Who cares? Yeah, no one cares, because you can't process it. And Stalin was like, yeah, I'm killing all of these people, but once I kill enough people, those that are left will thrive. We'll talk about this going on through the course. The 20th century was a violent, bloody group of 100 years. This is the most violent century in human history. And we were born at the tail end of it. Can you believe that? All right, the social impacts, however, of socialism and communism. And this is where I kind of explain how socialism and communism did ultimately fundamentally transform a lot of the systems that we know and appreciate. Socialism did filter into public policy over time. The United States is not a purely capitalist system. We do have socialistic elements in the society. And I love watching politicians squirm. Because when someone approaches it, it's usually Republicans that are doing it. I don't know why, because they don't know how to debate. But usually when a Republican comes out and says socialism is bad, the moderator will say, well, what do you think about public education? And the Republican's like, No, public education is a form of socialism. Same thing with public transportation and government mandated or government funded police services and government funded fire services. There's nothing wrong with that. That's just how our system works. So socialism did filter into public policy over time, like public education. But even then, we have private schools as well. Governments began banning underground work like mining for women and children, and then the maximum work hours for children were capped at 9 hours a day. And then the government began regulating working hours of women. Women had certain protections put in place in terms of how many hours they could work and what kind of job they could do, but men were not afforded the same protections.
This is in the United States.
This is throughout the West, the United States and in Europe. And men did not receive the same kind of protections. This is kind of a manifestation of socialism, because socialism, this principle, I guess you could say, of socialism went into the market, went into the workforce, and began saying who could do what. So women, you can't be minors anymore. Children, you can't work more than 9 hours anymore. Although if you tell any kid that they can't work more than 9 hours, they're going to be like, how about I work no more than 9 minutes? But the claim for regulating women's working hours was to protect the women's family role. But really all it did is it succeeded in reducing women's economic opportunities and created a perception that women are frail and need to be protected. So there you have it, where you had a socialist idea. Go in and regulate, the working hours of women in order to protect their family roles, but you created this image that women were these little wallflowers that need to be protected and shouldn't be working in dangerous jobs, for example. This is where you get the rise of that awful saying that a woman's place is in the kitchen, I guess you could say. Yeah, it's a man's world, that kind of thing. That came out of industrialism, and it came out of socialism filtering into public policy. As for the political impact, governments became responsible for the economic and social welfare of their system, of their citizens. We started seeing it in the United States with the New Deal. Before the Great Depression, the New Deal was put in place. Retirees had to plan for their own retirement, put together their own nest egg, and then if the money ran out, oh well, you're moving in with your kids. But after the New Deal and the Social Security system, a lot of people started thinking a little bit, well, why do I need to plan for my retirement when Social Security is going to take care of me? Which, by the way, that's horrible. Don't do that. Always prepare for the worst. Start saving money now. Whatever you can save, start saving money now. You'll thank me when you approach retirement age. Some of you are like, I got bills to pay. Yeah, so do I. Always pay yourself before you pay the bill collectors. Because what's the worst they could do? Take away your birthday? Bill collectors aren't going to be paying your bills when you retire. Okay, so the responsibility of living transitioned from the individual to the state. People started, I'll use the United States after the New Deal as an example. After the New Deal, American people began thinking that if they ran into hard times, the government would bail them out. Before that, the mentality was, if I run into hard times, only I can get myself out. And you started seeing kind of a growth in dependency, really. Think about, let's see, what really controversial topic can I talk about that would get me fired? The welfare system. I mean, the welfare system was put in place under, good intentions. People, have trouble, they run into financial difficulty, put them on welfare so that they can find their footing and then re-emerge into the working world and recover, right? But there are people that go on welfare and never get off.
Yeah.
So, good intention, poor execution.
They have more babies to stay.
Because they get paid more.
So what is the way around it? What do you think? Again, what do you think? Was it the...
I believe in a social safety net, which, it's funny, I say I'm a libertarian and everybody's like, you're not a real libertarian. I don't give a shit. Yeah, I believe in the social safety net. Like the social security system was originally designed to be a safety net. Everybody pays into it, but not everybody collects from it. But the problem is these social safety nets have a tendency to be politicized. So the social security system, which was a safety net put in place by FDR, everybody pays in, not everybody collects. I'm okay with that. But during Lyndon Johnson's presidency and the Great Society programs, he took Social Security and applied it to everybody to be a government-financed retirement program. So instead of it being a safety net, it became a government service that people then became dependent on. And the problem with government services is they get more expensive every year. And there are always more of them. Because eventually, think about how big the national debt is in the United States, $22 trillion. Eventually our debt is going to hit critical mass to where our only choice would be to stop paying for the social services that people rely on, or default on our debt and destroy our economy. And that's going to be our only choice. And either way, it's going to be a total shit show. Because if the economy collapses, everybody suffers. But if the government services get cut off, everybody that collects from it is going to riot. The same thing happened in Greece 10 years ago, less than 10 years ago. The Greek debt crisis. Anybody remember that? When people were like firebombing police stations. Because the Greek government began giving out a lot of government benefits and a lot of government jobs, and then they ran out of money. And all of those government jobs and benefits dried up. So now you had a lot of people who were unemployed, not collecting their not collecting paychecks, but unable to pay their bills either. And they rioted.
And what happened?
There was violence all throughout the country. The country's still in deep shit. They ended up getting bailed out by Germany. But Greece is a small enough economy to where a country like Germany can bail them out. Who can bail us out? We're the richest country in the world by far. So if we ever get into economic trouble, we're screwed. No one's going to save us.
So there could be a point where there will be no free standards, no.
Because eventually all the money's going to dry up. And the system will collapse under its own weight. Ronald Reagan said that a government program is the closest thing we'll ever get to eternal life on this earth. Because there's a government program put in place, never gets shut down. And it always grows. All right. That should guarantee that I don't have my job much longer. All right, so social programs that were put in place because of this. You had retirement pensions provided by the government. You had minimum wages provided by the government. Sickness, accident, and unemployment insurance provided by the government. And regulation of working hours and working conditions. All of that came out of the push for socialism and communism and everything like that. You also had trade unions popping up. Trade unions are a socialistic idea or communistic idea because it's collectivist. And think about what unions do. Collectivize an industry, and if your boss screws you over, you stop working for your boss and cost your boss a bunch of money. That's what trade unions are all about. That's what unionization is. Strength in numbers. Collectivize the factory. And if the boss doesn't do what we want him to do, we walk, he loses money. That's what trade unions are. So trade unions, there are two different types. You've got industrial unions, and then you've got trade unions, also known as craft unions. A trade union is a union for a very specific type of job. Like United Auto Workers, for example, is a trade union. United Auto Workers is a union for automakers or for employees of automakers that work on the assembly line. That's what they do. That's what that union operates. And United Auto Workers represents employees from Ford, Chevrolet, General Motors, Toyota, all the different auto manufacturers. Industrial unions are more of like an umbrella union. They look at a specific industry. So a famous example would be the Service Employees International Union. Big, powerful union. SEIU gets their support from people that work as chefs, bakers, janitors, bellhops, waiters and waitresses, that kind of thing, from the service industry, which runs a whole gamut of people that work within the service industry. That's the difference between those two types of unions. Yes?
The local unions and some trade unions?
Which one?
The local unions. From the city.
Oh, like city unions?
Yeah, local unions, like bricklayers, like the local union.
Oh, if it's a union for bricklayers, then that's a trade union.
You heard of 1199?
What?
You heard of 1199?
I'm sorry.
Have you heard of 1199?
Have I ever heard of 1199? No, I have not. What's that?
It's a union.
Is that a New York union?
Yeah.
I'm from California. Remember?
I think so.
I don't go around and look at them on the unions.
It's on the bus stops and everything. I think it's back that way.
Okay. Oh, so it's for government, it's for city employees, right?
Something like that.
A lot of times what unions will also do is they'll form alliances with each other. How many of you have ever heard of the garbage strike union that happened in New York City in the 70s?
Oh, and then they collect the garbage and then
Yeah.
they need it.
Oh, well, all the garbage collectors went on strike. But then the fire department and the police went on strike with them. So you have what's called collective bargaining, to where if one union thinks they're getting shafted, they'll call in their allies, and their allies will also go on strike in order to make things more uncomfortable.
Not the benevolent rights. Benevolent is like firefighters or
Well, firefighters and police, what they would do when they were supporting the garbage collectors is they wouldn't all go on strike because, I mean, if the city police were to suddenly just walk off the job one day, it'd be total chaos.
They can't do that, right?
No, they can't. It's actually inserted in their contract. Even though the police in New York City do have a union, they can only picket or strike when they are off duty. And that's how they get publicity. Well, because the city still needs to be taken care of. I mean, imagine what the outcry of the taxpayers would be in the city. If the cops are like, we're mad about our pay, we're going on strike, bye, police yourselves. You would have some group of people that would say, pay them what they want, and then you had another group of people that would say, they're not doing their job, fire them all. So it's, you've got that balancing act that you have to maintain. So in the 1970s, when the garbage collectors went on strike, the police and the fire department began demonstrating with them as a show of solidarity. And it made things look really bad for the New York City government. And they gave all of their garbage collectors a pay raise and cut their hours, which is what the garbage collectors wanted. Plus the fact people were walking down the street with garbage piles this high. Just citywide, it was disgusting. When unions first started popping up in the 1800s, they were originally outlawed. Because remember, this period of time, mid-1800s, was still the free market period, where trade unions have a tendency to, or unions themselves can disrupt the workflow. If you stop working, the company isn't making any profit, right? And if the policy of the day is to promote as much business as you possibly can, a union going on strike can screw that up. So unions were originally deemed illegal, and oftentimes they were violently attacked. We talked about what happened at the Homestead Steel Mill when the Pinkerton detectives were set in to break the strike. We talked about that last week. There were a bunch of people got killed. There was another strike that happened in the United States. Pullman Train Cars was a company that had a government contract. They were manufacturing mail carrier cars for the trains, for the U.S. Postal Service. And there was a strike at Pullman, and the government's contract for train cars for the Postal Service was not being filled. So the president sent in the troops to break the strike up. And a lot of people got killed. But over time, unions were legitimized, they were legalized, they grew in power, they became more political, and they began pushing for reforms. And what I find ironic about the unions and unionization is that unionization is a socialist/communistic idea. But it also undermines Marxist theory. Because Marx is like the proletariat will rise up against the bourgeoisie and overthrow the system. And then trade unions come in and they're like, well, help us improve the lives of our employees. And if employees are happy, they're not going to rebel. So a Marxist idea ended up helping undermining Marx's main idea. All right. That'll do with the economic side of today's class. Do you have any questions about what we talked about? I know that was a lot.
We hate it.
You hate it? As you eat your chips peacefully?
I can't.
I'm having fun today. All right, nationalism. Let's talk about this. What's nationalism?
Believing your culture is the best for your national, where you're from, the best.
Okay. Yeah. Would you say like national pride?
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else? Yeah, that basically summarizes it.
What you stand for? Like your rights? Or?
Well, I mean, in a way, yes. But nationalism has everything to do with the country that you live in.
You would do anything you want to protect your country.
Okay.
You're ready to die for your country.
Yeah, that's nationalism.
Like those families that are like pro-military that they say you go, you're gonna fight for the country, this is what we stand for, this is what we stand for.
America, love it or leave it, right?
Yeah.
I love those people. They're so funny. Yeah, that's essentially what nationalism is. Nationalism can be defined as patriotic feelings, principles, or efforts. What you said is probably the most accurate description. Nationalism, but I want to add a little caveat to it. Nationalism is having pride in your country of origin, regardless of your personal experience. And I wanted to add that little caveat for a very good reason. Because we all know some people that are born somewhere around the world that probably had a pretty rough life growing up. I mean, there are people that live in the United States that grow up in poverty, you know, get in and out of prison, not exactly the best life possible, but they still love their country. And they love their country without question. There are people that were born in abject poverty in rural Mexico or Venezuela or parts of Africa and had really, really hard lives, but they still love their country. That's what nationalism is. Regardless of your personal experiences having pride in your country. Is nationalism good or bad? And I'm bringing that question up because if you watched any of the news recently, especially since the Trump election, everybody's saying nationalism is the worst thing on earth.
I think that nationalism tends to turn into racism.
It can, yes, it definitely
Like
can.
Tommy Larry, like example, like she claims nationalism, but she's really racist.
Tommy Larry?
You know who she is? Either?
Oh, I know who she is.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, you agree with her? What?
She's
Oh, I
like
don't
so
watch her
like,
stuff. I don't follow her, I don't have a Twitter or anything like that. I know who she is.
Oh.
I troll her.
What?
I troll her on Instagram.
Yeah, nationalism can become racist, absolutely. Because you can have an extreme of anything. But would you generally say that, you know, if you take the extreme examples, like let's say Tommy Larry, I don't personally think she's a racist. She does say some really provocative shit. But
I think
would
that
you,
she's I think that she's sorry. I think she says things like she just don't care, like she just says what's on her mind.
Trump?
No.
Trump's the same thing, yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, they're just alike. They just don't care what they say. They say what's on their mind. It's either you accept it or you don't. Like she's still gonna be around, like or do what the hell she does.
Well, all right. With those examples, let's take the extreme examples, like you said. Would you use those extreme examples to say nationalism as a whole is bad?
It's not bad.
Okay. You don't. Who here thinks that nationalism generally is bad?
I think it's
Who here thinks it's generally good? And who's in the middle? Yeah, it depends. It really depends.
It depends what you love about your country. Like some people could love their country's culture, but some people could like their country's government.
And it also depends on how the pride of your country manifests. So, okay, I'm going to connect this to American history again. The Vietnam War. When the Vietnam War broke out, you had the older generation, the ones who had fought in World War II in Korea, that saw Vietnam as yet another war against an evil faction. It was very black or white for that generation because that's what World War II was about. And that's what the Korean War was. It was a very black and white conflict. Though we know that Vietnam was not actually a black and white conflict. It was a very, very murky conflict. But you have the older generation that was looking at the Vietnam War and saying, well, this is another burden that's fallen onto our country. To be a good American, you must support the war effort, and you must support the troops, and you must support the president. Right? That was the older generation problem. But the younger generation, the ones who were actually fighting in Vietnam, were like, it's not clear-cut. This is not a righteous war for us, and in order to be a good American, you must question what your president does. You must question what the policy of the Congress is. This is both forms of nationalism, if you think about this, because both sides were arguing that what they want is for the better, or for the good of the nation. The older generation saying it's for the good of the nation that we show solidarity during a time of war and we work together to destroy the enemy. And then the younger generation was saying it's for the good of the nation to show solidarity that our government is lying to us and hold them accountable. And then those two generations clashed. They actually started fighting each other, physically fighting each other. I was watching an interview from a Vietnam veteran who said he turned on a TV to see one of the riots that was happening, I think, in Washington, D.C. And he said, I saw a police officer that looked like my dad beating the hell out of a kid that looked like me. And that's what Vietnam did. And this is where I want to come up with nationalism and how nationalism depends on how it manifests. Because you can be nationalistic and have completely different goals from other people around. There's no blanket or universal approach to demonstrating nationalism. But what nationalism is, as a term, it's a relatively new concept for us because it hasn't really been defined until the 1800s. But the idea of it has been around for thousands of years. Like, for example, during the 1300s, France and England went to war with each other, and the war lasted for 116 years. Can you imagine a war lasting a century? But at the beginning of the war, French soldiers were fighting because they were told to fight. They were obeying the orders of their lords. By the end of the war, they were fighting for France. They didn't give a shit what their lords said, they were fighting for their home. And that's a manifestation of nationalism. Here's an example of American nationalism before and after 9/11. For those of you who remember 9/11, remember the flags that came up everywhere?
I saw the plane.
Yep. Nationalism's common denominator are wars or other periods of crisis. And what that does is it brings people together based on cultural commonality. Now that's where it can become racist. Because if the cultural commonality is latching onto a specific race, then anybody that's in the in club is in the club, everybody out is shunned. So like Nazi Germany, that was a toxic form of nationalism. But nationalism in the United States is generally what holds us together. Because if you think about this, people in America come from all different walks of life. And we come from different parts of the world, especially in the more diverse areas, like let's say San Francisco or New York. Anywhere else in the world, we would hate each other, we'd kill each other, because we all have competing goals. But in America, we don't. Our goals are the same. Regardless of where you come from, what is the goal of being an American? Make money, take care of your family, and enjoy life. That's our goal. That's the cultural commonality of the United States. And that's why places that are extremely diverse, like New York City, thrive. Because nationalism is the glue that holds us together. Does that make sense? Also, at other kinds of cultural commonalities, we generally all speak the same language, and most of us worship the same religion, or pretty close to it. As it pertains to the lessons we were talking about, we're going to kind of tie this back to the French Revolution. The French Revolution is what brought nationalism into the forefront of global politics. Because nationalism was used in order to fight the revolution itself, especially with Napoleon. So the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars had this nationalistic effect on virtually all Europeans. I mean, think about this. How did Napoleon become so successful?
Dragon.
All French citizens, all defenders of the fatherland follow me. All those who love France follow me. Nationalism was used to build Napoleon's army. And how do you fight Napoleon? You use nationalism. All good Prussians will resist this French tyrant. All good Russians will resist this French tyrant. And when Napoleon was defeated, the European leaders generally embraced nationalism as a way to maintain social order. Because with Napoleon gone and all of the old monarchies back in control, how do you maintain order? How do you weaponize nationalism to control your population? All good French citizens will obey the King of France. All good Russian citizens will obey the Tsar. You can see how nationalism can be used as a means of control as well. So nationalism is very much a double-edged sword. You can have good nationalism, you have toxic nationalism.
It's like religion. It's something like you gotta do what's right, like working for the government.
Yeah, exactly. You can believe in a religion and you can enjoy it and you can share it with others, but when you start believing that your religion is the only religion that is right, that's what opens the door for violence.
ISIS.
Yeah, crisis. What caused all the religious holy wars in the 13 or 14, 1500s? My way of worshiping God is superior to your way of worshiping God, so I'm going to kill you until you recognize that fact. So I think one of the universal lessons that I'm trying to propose is that a lot of these ideas that we're talking about can be good things, but too much of anything is bad. Okay, as for nationalism, since the European monarchs were embracing nationalism in order to control their populations, this guy, Clemens von Metternich, was the one that made the whole system work. He was the Austrian foreign minister during the Napoleonic Wars. He was a top diplomat. He shook all the hands, he greased all the palms, he knew everybody. So when Napoleon was finally defeated, he was the most obvious choice to kind of put together the new post-Napoleon social order. And he developed a system that's called the Concert of Europe. The Concert of Europe was a collaboration between the 5 superpowers in Europe: Britain, France, Prussia, Austria, and Russia. These 5 powers, rather than being historical rivals, which they had been for generations, they began working with each other, specifically their royal families. Because one royal family had already got their head cut off. So all the other royal families of England, Prussia, France, Austria, and Russia were all like, okay, let's pool our resources, and rather than being, rivals with each other for the empires that we were building in the previous generation, let's help each other keep power. So rather than having rivalries between nations, the governments of these 5 nations were working together in order to suppress their people.
That's how he was able to rule France being Austria.
He was able to push nationalism in places like France, and he supported the King of France.
But how is it, like, if I'm a nationalist, I wouldn't want, like, say I'm Dominican, I wouldn't want somebody else from another country to come run my country because I want a Dominican to run.
Exactly, and that's why nationalism didn't work all that well as a weapon thing. Because keep in mind, Metternich was Austrian, you're right, but at least, let's say you were living in France, the King of France is still French. Metternich was the one that was working with him behind the scenes, but as a French citizen, you would see the King of France ruling over you. Someone that speaks your language, worships your religion, that kind of thing. Something that you have some kind of national tie to. But Metternich would be the one that would whisper in his ear, have this festival glorifying France and the people will love you for it. Also in 1815, the lines on the map were kind of redrawn and a balance of power was established with the Congress of Vienna. The Congress of Vienna was this loose confederation, I guess you could say, or this agreement between the superpowers. France, Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia. And we talked about this 2 weeks ago, and how the Congress of Vienna was designed to solve diplomatic crises before war broke out. The Congress of Vienna, the Concert of Europe, was actually designed for 2 things. 1, keep the big powers from going to war with each other, and 2, keep the governments of the big powers from being overthrown by their own people. So that's what it ultimately boiled down to. Each of these, what I call the Big Five, were roughly on equal footing, politically, militarily, economically, that kind of thing. And the Concert of Europe was designed to solve diplomatic crisis before war broke out. And it worked, because from 1815 to 1914, 99 years, the major powers in Europe did not go to war with each other. I mean, there were a few little brush fires, like France and Russia got into a pissing contest in the Crimea, but that was not considered a major war. But the Concert of Vienna was also designed to keep ruling families in charge of their respective countries and to support each other against liberal revolutions. There's something I do want to define, though. How many of you know the difference between being a conservative and being a liberal? It means different things to different people.
The way you dress. The way you dress. The way you dress.
Okay. Well, what would be conservative in the way you dress?
Like covered up.
Okay, covered up. And why would that be considered conservative?
Conservative. Covering yourself.
You're covering yourself, okay.
Sorry. So, to be a liberal, mostly people don't like to be tagged or labeled. They, like to try new things and be out there. But when you're conservative, you go by the old-fashioned way. What you were born into, you follow it.
Yeah, actually, that's pretty good. Conservatism, or being conservative, is a commitment to traditional values. So as it says with your example with dressing up, being conservative and dressing up and covering yourself up is because people in the past covered themselves up. Okay, so conservatism and liberalism, I want to define these terms first, and then talk about how they apply to different things. Because a European conservative and American conservative are 2 totally different things. So conservatism is commitment to traditional values and ideas with opposition to change or innovation. Liberalism is open to new behavior or opinions and willing to discard traditional values. However, you've got to put this into context of the society that you're looking at. A European conservative, the tradition in Europe was monarchy. So a European conservative would lean more towards monarchy, keeping power out of the hands of the common people, allowing a specific class of people, usually in the form of an educated group of people, or those who were related to the royal family, European conservatives generally advocate that power should be kept away from the masses, kind of like a de-democratization of Europe. Whereas the European liberal would argue that democratic institutions should be expanded in Europe, because it's a rejection of the traditional values of the old monarchy system. But the United States, the word conservative and liberal means different things for us, and that's because the American tradition is a lot different. America never had a king, or at least not as a country. When we were colonies, we had a king, and we hated him.
Really, who was?
When we were American colonies, we were under the rules of like Charles, James, George I, II, III.
Okay.
We weren't the United States yet.
What was the name before? What was the name before you got
The colonies, 13 countries.
Yeah, the 13 colonies. The traditional value of the United States is constitutionality and limited government. An American conservative generally adheres to the writing of the Constitution, what we'll call strict constructionism. We'll actually discuss that next week. So I'm not going to get too far ahead of myself. But an American conservative would adhere to what is written in the Constitution and want to limit the government in all manners. An American liberal is more open to using government control or using government power in order to force social or political change. So American conservatives don't like big government, American liberals generally do. Which is the opposite of Europe, because European conservatives like monarchies, big government, and European liberals don't like big government. They like smaller government. Make sense? Okay.
So, Professor?
Yes.
So the monarchies were based on bloodlines, right?
Correct. So you would be born into a family and be considered either noble or aristocratic or monarch. Okay, I'm throwing this map up. This is a map of the ethnic diversity in the Austrian Empire, although this map is from 1910. It's still valid for our specific lesson, because the Austrian Empire controlled stuff in the 1800s down here like Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania. It controlled more land, but the ethnic makeup was still accurate in this. If Metternich was going around Europe and pushing nationalism, he could not push nationalism in his own country because of the ethnic background or the ethnic diversity in Austria. Because the Austrian Empire was a multi-ethnic empire comprised of a bunch of people from different ethnic groups. None of them spoke the same language. Many of them were not the same religion. There was no national commonality for the people living under the Austrian Empire, except maybe that they all equally hated being under Austrian rule. That's about it. They all hated the ruling class. But in the Austrian Empire, you had Serbs and Croats, you had Hungarians, you had Ukrainians, you had Czechs and Slovaks, you had Romanians, you had Germans, you had Italians. You had all of these different ethnic groups. So if nationalism ever broke free in the Austrian Empire, that would be a fat mess. Because you would have people that spoke Hungarian saying, well, why don't we control our own country? Why are we taking the orders from the Germans? Because the Germans, which the guys in red, that was the ruling class of the Austrian Empire. They were all German speakers. So you had Hungarians and Italians and Poles and Croats and Serbians all under the rule of Germans. And they're like, and if nationalism ever got out in the Austrian Empire, the empire would dissolve. And that's why the empire isn't around today. So Metternich was put in charge of keeping national identity suppressed in the Austrian Empire. So imagine how that kind of worked out. He would go to France. Hey, you're French. This is France. You're French. Be proud to be French. That's great. And then he would go to Prussia. Hey, you're Prussian. Be proud to be Prussian. That's great. And then he'd go home. Everybody shut up. And that's basically what happened. It did not work that well. Because in the 1820s and the 1830s, the Balkan regions, which the Balkans is like Montenegro, Serbia, Bulgaria, Romania, Hungary, Greece. The Balkans is called the powder keg of Europe because there are a whole lot of ethnic groups that live in that area, and they generally don't like each other. And they've been fighting wars for centuries. But nationalist identity, or a surge of nationalist identity in the Balkans, caused a surge of rebellions in the Balkans. An example being Greece. Greek people speak Greek. They're Orthodox Christian. You can identify them as Greek. They know who they are. They recognize each other, that kind of thing, based on language, based on custom, based on tradition. But Greece fell under the control of the Ottoman Turks in 1453 when Constantinople fell. But Greece didn't fight a war of independence until 1821. So they fall under Turkish rule in 1453. 350 years later, then they fight a war of independence. Why did it take 350 years for the Greeks to figure out, hey, maybe we shouldn't be ruled by Turkish-speaking Muslims?
Maybe because they were treated them good.
Because what?
Maybe they were treated them good. They haven't-
Well, for a while, the Greeks actually were treated pretty well by their
Yeah,
Ottoman
it was a reason
subjects.
for that, because it was a good.
But nationalism also wasn't a thing. So when the Greeks were subjugated by the Ottomans, a lot of the common Greeks were like, "Nope, this is our lot in life now. We were Byzantines and now we're Ottoman subjects. Oh well, I pay my taxes, I keep my head down." But in 1821, a lot of people in Greece were like, whoa, 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 you're Greek. Be proud to be Greek. Greeks should rule themselves. So there was a rebellion that broke out, became a war of independence that lasted from 1821 to 1829. Western Europeans, who were all caught up in the nationalistic fervor, also sent weapons and money and men to Greece. France and Russia and England sent weapons and money. People were volunteering from all over Western Europe. There was an English poet named Lord Byron, very famous poet, who fought and died in the Greek independence movement. He fought for a country that wasn't even his and died for it because he believed in the idea of nationalism, that Greeks should be able to rule Greece, free of the Ottoman Turks. This was followed up by rebellions in France, Spain, Portugal, Belgium, Poland, and Italy, all pushing for social reform or the establishment of independent states. The French rebellion got a little bit of traction when the French King Charles X was forced out of power and replaced by his cousin Louis Philippe, who was looked at as more of a reformer. Belgium ended up winning its independence from the Netherlands. The Netherlands controlled Belgium, and Belgium broke free of the Netherlands because they speak a different language than the Dutch. And the Belgians didn't want to be under Dutch control anymore because of nationalism. They're like, we speak a different language. We have different national goals. We should not be under the rule of the Dutch. And they broke free. If what happened in the 1820s and 1830s got the big powers' attention, they haven't seen anything yet. In 1848, there were widespread rebellions across Europe, and it's called the Revolutions of 1848. It is the largest single wave of rebellions in human history. 50 countries saw unrest, and this is before social media, and they all spontaneously started around the same time. So 50 countries saw unrest. These rebellions were driven by demand for more political freedoms. Some were driven by economic reform. The rebellion that started in London in 1848 corresponded to the publishing of the Communist Manifesto in London. So people started getting copies of the Communist Manifesto. They're like, all right, time to bring in the communist utopia. And they rebelled against their rulers. But most of the revolutions of 1848 were caused by dissatisfaction with the ruling class or nationalism. There were rebellions in areas that were being controlled by other people. Like there were rebellions in Berlin. The rebellion in Berlin was about reforming the government. There was a rebellion in Milan. Milan was a puppet of the French, and Milan wanted to be independent. There was a rebellion in Poland. Poland had been carved up by the Austrians, the Prussians, and the Russians. And the Polish wanted to re-establish their own country. Although the Polish version kind of took on a very French flavor because Polish commoners began cutting the heads off their aristocrats during their rebellions. There was a rebellion in Denmark. People were looking for government reforms in Denmark. This is a painting of Danish troops marching through Copenhagen. Serbia rebelled from the Ottoman Empire and won its independence. This is a painting of the Serbians declaring their independence from the Ottoman Empire. And you can't exactly have a rebellion without the French being involved somehow, so there were rebellions in Paris called the June Uprising, I believe is what it's called. For any of you who have read or seen Les Miserables, that's the rebellion that takes place in Les Miserables.
What the hell?
Yeah.
After the bombings, right? Now that's not,
What's up?
that's now, right?
What do you mean?
That, like, the-
Oh, it's just a joke. that
I
Greece
know
is
it's
on.
a joke, I know, but I'm saying that's like for now, right?
Oh yeah,
After all the bombings.
Oh yeah, with the Yellow Vest protest. And actually, the Yellow Vest protest was put in place for a tax. The Yellow Vest demonstrations that's been going on in Paris or in France right now is because of taxation. So the government imposed a gasoline tax for to combat climate change. Well, all the drivers in Paris are like, well, we're already paying like $8 a gallon, and you're charging us even more, so they're all protesting. And then the government, instead of like responding the way the government should, sorry, we'll try to find revenue elsewhere, they sent the troops in. And now the people are really pissed. Emmanuel Macron, his popularity rating in France is lower than the popular rating of the US Congress. And US Congress has not had a popularity rating above 20% in like 50 years. All right, the outcome of the revolutions of 1848. It flipped the European order on its head. Metternich was forced into retirement because clearly he was not able to maintain control of the situation. Now, the rebellions are generally considered a failure. And that's because the old order did maintain power. But France went through a pretty dramatic transformation. King Louis Philippe was forced out of power. He abdicated the throne. And France tried to democratize itself immediately after. They held an election. And they were going to form a republic. And they elected this outsider who had zero political experience whatsoever, but he had a very famous name. His name was Charles Louis Napoleon Bonaparte. He was Napoleon Bonaparte's nephew. And he runs for president of the new Republic of France, and everybody in France is like, oh my God, I love Napoleon, I'm going to vote for his nephew. And as soon as Charles Louis Napoleon was elected president, he overthrew the Republic, formed an empire, and called himself Emperor Napoleon III. So let's track the French Revolution so far. It starts as a monarchy, then becomes a constitutional monarchy, then descends into anarchy, then becomes a dictatorship, then goes back into anarchy, then becomes an oligarchy, then becomes a dictatorship, then it goes back to a monarchy, then a republic for 5 minutes, and now back to a dictatorship. It's like, come on, France, get your shit together. That's Emperor Napoleon. Very pretty fellow. What's up? Oh, facial hair back in the 1800s? You ain't seen nothing yet. I got some pictures you're gonna like. All right, let's talk about one of the consequences of nationalism. To look at two unification movements. Italian unification. Italy was all the big powers of Europe's playbox. They used to play around with Italy all the time. But Italian unification was this dream that had existed for hundreds of years and finally got traction with this fellow, Giuseppe Mazzini, who lived from 1805 to 1872. He formed a political action group called Young Italy, advocating for the unification of Italy and the independence of Italy. Italy had been carved up by most of the big powers. So the Kingdom of Sardinia, this country was independent. But Venice was under the control of Austria. This strip of land right here, that's called Lombardy. That was also under Austrian control. The Papal States were run by the Pope. The Kingdom of Sicily was run by Spain, or a puppet of Spain. And then you had, Genoa was under French influence. Tuscany was under the Pope's influence. Parma, and Modena, and Trent, and all kinds of things. These either fell under the control of the Austrians, the French, or the Pope.
That's why they're so diverse, Italians.
In the north, they're very diverse.
Like they look different, they just don't have like a specific look.
Yeah, I look like your prototypical white boy. I'm actually Italian. And that's because all my family's from northern Italy. So I have a lot of French in me, and I have a lot of Austrian in me. I know, right? I probably have, I'm a mutt. I probably have some Scotch-Irish in me from my grandmother's side. Because my grandmother's family's from Virginia, and has been living in Virginia since like the 1700s. But like, both of my dad's parents were from Italy, and my mom's father was from Italy. But all northern Italian. So that's why I'm so pale. I can't go out in the sun. All right, so I mentioned something about facial hair.
Yeah.
You ready? Oh yes. Oh yes. I asked my girlfriend how she would react if I decided to grow this beautiful thing. And she looked at me square in the face and said, I'd shave you while you slept. All right, so you have the political motivations for for Italian unification. but now you need the willpower, you need the muscle to do it. And fortunately, King Victor Emmanuel of Sardinia also embraced the idea of unifying Italy. And his chief of staff / prime minister, Count Camillo de Cavour, had the political know-how in order to get it done. Cavour realized that Italian unification could not happen without Italy going toe-to-toe with one of the big powers in Europe. So he wanted to make friends with one of the big dogs to have some muscle when they go against the other big dog. And because of their proximity to France, it made sense for Sardinia to team up with France. So Cavour forged an alliance with Napoleon III, in which Sardinia gave up control of the city of Nice, which was a beautiful source of tax revenue. France got a nice big city with a lot of tax revenue, and in exchange, France pledged military assistance to the Sardinians against the Austrians. With that in the bag, Cavour provoked a war against Austria in 1859. And the Austrian army, which had reverted back to its aristocratic roots rather than a meritocracy, couldn't get out of its own way.
Was aristocrat.
Which means in the Austrian army in 1859, in order to be an officer, you had to belong to a member of the nobility.
So they go over.
Yeah, they were noble, and they were all dumb. So the Austrian army was completely inept. It took them 10 days to march 50 miles.
Weren't they like really artsy and people like really like?
Depending on where you were. The Austrian army was in really bad shape in the 1850s because they were drawing soldiers from all over the empire, which means you had German-speaking soldiers, Hungarian-speaking soldiers, Ukrainian-speaking soldiers, Italian-speaking soldiers, but all of the officers spoke German. So how do you give orders to people that don't speak German? You really can't. So the Austrian army was completely hopeless. They marched 5 miles a day. I told that to a student last semester who was in the army. He damn near fell out of his chair. He was laughing so hard. Because apparently a soldier is expected to be able to march 12 or 15 miles a day. And the Austrian army could only do 5. So, but by the time the Austrian army even arrived to challenge the Sardinians, the French had arrived in force too. And the Austrians are like, well, this is a bust, and they went home. And they signed an agreement with the Sardinians and gave up control of Lombardy. And then a bunch of the other surrounding areas fell under the control of Sardinia as well. So in one move, northern Italy, except for Venice, was unified under Sardinian control. The south was a different story. The south was unified by this guy, Giuseppe Garibaldi. Garibaldi was a mercenary. He was a combat veteran. He was also known as Garibaldi the Red because he wore this bright red shirt. And all of his followers did. They were called the Red Shirts. He was also a fanatical nationalist. He wanted Italy unified more than anything, and he was willing to fight anybody to do it. Well, he lived in the south. So with the unification movement happening in the north, Garibaldi decided he would also do it in the south. And he put together an army of about 1,200 men and just bounced from town to town to town, kicking all the Spanish authorities out. There really wasn't a whole lot of violence, and when there was fighting, it was short and it was over very fast with minimal loss of life. But he did unify southern Italy. So now you've got Garibaldi in charge of the south, and Cavour, and by extension King Victor Emmanuel, in charge of the north. So how do you unify the two countries? Victor Emmanuel, being the king of Sardinia, wanted to unify Italy as a monarchy so he would become the king of Italy. Garibaldi was a republican. He wanted Italy to be a republic. How do you rectify that? So in 1861, Victor Emmanuel met with Garibaldi in I think, right outside the city of Naples. And I would have loved to have been a fly on the wall in that tent for that conversation, because apparently these guys drank each other out under the table during their talk. They just got hammered during their negotiations. But they also came to the realization during their negotiations that a unified Italy was far more important than their individual ambitions. So they made a compromise. Garibaldi wanted a republic because he was afraid that a monarchy would be used to trample the rights of the newly unified Italian state. Emmanuel wanted a monarchy because he wanted to retain his power. So they compromised. And Victor Emmanuel essentially agreed to limit his power and sign a constitution into law. So Victor Emmanuel gave up some of his power. Individual rights of Italians were protected by constitution. Both sides shook hands, and Garibaldi proclaimed Victor Emmanuel the king of Italy. But after 1861, the unification of the rest of the Italian peninsula would require outside help, because Austria still controlled Venice, and Rome was under the control of the French. So if you want Rome, you got to fight the French. If you want Venice, you have to fight the Austrians. And the Italians weren't able to fight either of them. Fortunately, however, Prussia was also going through the moves of unifying German-speaking people. And Prussia ended up going to war with France and Austria. When Prussia went to war with Austria in 1866, Cavour kind of planted the seed to the Prussian government and said, hey, when you negotiate with the Austrians for control of territory, have them give you Venice, and have them give Venice to the French. So in the negotiations, Austria gave Venice to the French, and then the French, honoring their alliance with the Italians, gave Venice to the Italians. So Italy got control of Venice without bloodshed, or at least without them having to fight. And then when France and Prussia went to war in 1871, France had to pull all of its troops out of Rome in order to fight in their home country, and when the troops left Rome, the Italians moved in. Speaking of Italian unification, let's talk about these guys. Same story. The unification movement was pushed by King, or Kaiser, which means King, King William I, Kaiser Wilhelm I, and his Prime Minister, Otto von Bismarck, or his Chancellor, the guy who ran the German Parliament. Unification of Germany was a little bit more of a mess. Everything within this red line represents the boundaries of a municipality that Napoleon created called the German Confederation. Basically, everybody inside this red line spoke German. But you can see that Austria controlled a lot of land outside of the German-speaking areas, and Prussia controlled some. Prussia, by the way, is in blue, Austria is in yellow. But this is the German world. And all of these gray areas were German states that were unincorporated. They were either puppets of somebody, or puppets to each other, or semi-independent, or fully independent, but they did not belong to any of the big powers. When the Congress of Vienna was put together and the Concert of Europe was established, every country had a strength and a weakness in order to maintain the balance of power, so that no one country would be powerful enough to challenge everybody else the way Napoleon did. France, for example, had a very large population, but their Achilles heel is that their economy wasn't in the best of shape. Prussia had a fantastic military, but their weakness was they didn't have a big population. Austria had a big military, but a disloyal population. England had a big navy, no army. And that's what the strength and weakness thing. That's how the balance of power was established. But if Prussia was able to unify all of the German-speaking states, that would solve their population crisis. So now they have a big population to go with their big army. And that would make them very dangerous. The Prussians historically have been a military power. Napoleon once joked that Prussia hatched out of a cannonball because they'd been militant for their entire history. Now with Bismarck, who was controlling Prussia, he knew that the unification movement could not be done peacefully. So he embraced a belief in what he called realpolitik, the politics of reality. And he believed that German unification could not be done through diplomacy. It had to be done by what he called, quote, by blood and iron. That's what earned him the nickname the Iron Chancellor, because he was willing to fight to unify the German-speaking world. So he provoked 3 wars. He went to war with Denmark in order to control the northern states. He went to war with Austria in order to get control of these states. And then he went to war with France to get these states. Yeah, war. The war with Denmark lasted a couple of weeks. The war with Austria lasted a couple of months. They were short, they were quick, they were over really, really fast, because the Prussian army was really good. The war with France went on for a year and a half. German unification efforts upset that balance of power that was set by the Congress of Vienna. And Napoleon III, wanting to maintain the balance of power, demanded territorial concessions in order to offset what Prussia had gained. And Bismarck said, no, we are unifying the German world whether you like it or not. And using a succession crisis in Spain as a pretense, which nobody gave a shit about, Napoleon declared war on Prussia. Even though none of these countries had anything to do with the succession crisis in Spain, really they were just looking for an excuse to go to war with each other. They were both looking for an excuse. Napoleon believed that he could win the war. And Napoleon also was kind of living in his uncle's shadow. Because, Napoleon Bonaparte, considered one of the top 5 generals of all time, And his nephew was like, well, I'm a pretty good administrator, but I don't have the military glory that my uncle did. So he's like, if I could fight the Prussians and beat them, then I can also tell the rest of the world that I am just as good as my uncle. So that's another reason why he was pushing for war. The problem was Napoleon severely underestimated how quickly he could mobilize the French army, and the Prussian army was experienced because they had already fought 2 wars previously. So their soldiers were experienced, their army was assembled, and all of the equipment was ready. France could not say the same thing. The Prussians plowed through the French. It was extremely one-sided. Napoleon himself was taken prisoner of war. That's embarrassing. The French army has one job, protect the emperor, and they couldn't even do that. The Prussians marched all the way to Paris and then stopped. They get to Paris and they're like, should we shoot the city? Nah, I don't feel like killing civilians. And that was actually kind of insulting to the French, because the French were like, we can still fight, come on, shoot at us. And the Prussians are like, now we proved our point. Which was like rubbing salt in the wound. This is a sketch of Napoleon meeting with Otto von Bismarck after he'd been captured. And oh man, I would have loved to have heard that conversation. I don't know what happened, Otto. My army said they were ready. The casualties of the war, the aftermath, was just a tiny taste of what was coming down the pipeline. Europe should have been paying attention with the Franco-Prussian War, because even though this war was quick, it was pretty bloody. And it gave a taste of what modern warfare was becoming. And if people were actually paying attention to this, maybe the bloodshed of World War I could have been avoided. But France lost 138,000 dead, over 140,000 wounded, and 500,000 captured. Prussia suffered 28,000 dead, about 90,000 wounded. That's still pretty steep for a war as quick as the Franco-Prussian War, because it only lasted a year and a half. Either way, with the result, this is a painting of Kaiser Wilhelm declaring the German Empire. Kaiser Wilhelm right here, Otto von Bismarck over here. Prussia stopped being Prussia and started calling itself Germany, because they unified all of the German-speaking states. And that's where they get the birth of the German Empire. Northern France was placed under military occupation until they could pay an extortionate war reparation. Germany then held a victory parade in Paris. Way to kick the French while they're down. Kind of rubbing it in their face a little bit. Between May 21st and May 28th, though, there was a communist uprising in Paris that killed 10,000 people, called the Paris Commune. And the middle class of Paris left. About 200,000 Parisians left the city. And the writing was on the wall that there was a substantial communist movement going on in France. But all of the German states were unified under Prussian rule. Modern Germany formed. Even some land that had been under the control of the French, a territory called Alsace-Lorraine, was taken over by the Germans. Alsace-Lorraine is one of those nagging issues between the Germans and the French, all the way up through both world wars. Alsace-Lorraine is a territory that borders between France and Germany. About half of the population speaks German, the other half of the population speaks French. Not so much anymore. After World War II, all the German-speaking people in Alsace-Lorraine were driven into Germany. So Alsace-Lorraine is now clearly French. But in 1871, it was a 50-50 split. And the French claimed half of it, and the Germans claimed half of it, and they decided they just wanted to control the whole territory. Alsace-Lorraine swapped hands 3 times in between 1870 and 1945. However, what happened in France, for those of you with eagle eyes, you can see the teacher is pointing to a blacked out part in the French map. He's pointing to Alsace-Lorraine, the lost territory. A phenomenon in France occurs called revanchism, which literally translates to revengeism. After the Franco-Prussian War, an entire generation of French children were taught that Germans were evil, that they're awful people, that you must hate them, that you must fight them every chance you get, that they are diabolical, they will stab you in the back, they're awful, awful, awful evil people. Right? An entire generation, this was indoctrinated into an entire generation of French children. And the reason I'm stressing this so much is because this generation of school children were the leaders of state. They were the ruling class when World War I broke out.
Oh, okay, so that explains.
17 million people died in World War I. Another 20 million people were wounded. All because an entire generation of French people were taught that Germans were awful people. So when the war broke out between France and Germany, the ruling class of France did not want to negotiate because they wanted to kill Germans. And when World War I ended, that guaranteed that World War II was going to happen.
And the Hitler movement wasn't making them look any better. The Hitler movement wasn't making them look any better.
Well, because Hitler got power because after World War I, the ruling class of France wanted to punish Germany. They wanted to do to Germany what Germany had done to them in 1871. So the French were like, okay, well the Germans made us pay an extortionate war reparation and then marched troops through Paris.
They took them out of their country, right? Too. They took the French out of Germany, something like that.
Wait, what?
They took like the French out of Germany too, right?
No, the French went into Germany after World War I.
And
So-
it was like something like somebody invaded somebody or somebody told them to get out of their country.
Yeah, when the war, in World War I, the Germans invaded France. But when the war ended, the French, the ruling class that had been taught Germans are awful people, tried to make the peace as punishing and as damaging to Germany as humanly possible. And Germany saw no other way to get out from under this weight of their punishment for World War I than to turn to someone like Adolf Hitler. So here you have a situation where revanchism, a generation of children being taught to hate Germans, guaranteed that 2 world wars would happen. And 80 million people were killed because of it. Let's check the time. I am almost done. All right, making good time here. Let's talk about the decline of the Ottoman Empire. This is going to go real fast and I'll get you out of here. This map shows pretty much all of the territory that the Ottoman Empire controlled at the peak of their power, but each color corresponds to a part of the empire that broke free over time. When you get the slides, you can look at the color code over here. But the Ottoman Empire was declining between 1717 and 1923. It was this big empire that began to shrink over the span of 205 years until it completely dissolved. But after centuries of virtually unchecked power, the Ottoman Empire began to collapse under its own weight. The Ottomans were so powerful because they were ahead of the game militarily than everybody else. The Ottomans were the first people to use cannons in warfare. They were the first ones to use large numbers of gunpowder weapons in warfare. Their army was better equipped, better trained. They were an extremely powerful empire. They laid siege to Vienna twice. And they almost took the city the second time. Military reforms, however, were slow. And the Ottoman armies ended up falling behind those of their European counterparts in weapons, tactics, and training. An elite corps of the Ottoman Empire, named the Janissary Corps, which was supposed to be the bodyguards of the Sultan, got political. And the Janissaries preferred tradition over innovation and began regularly overthrowing sultans and installing puppets. This is a picture of the Janissaries. They were identifiable by their bright red coats and their bright blue pants.
Oh, the Janissaries.
They were loyal to the Sultan. They were supposed to be the Sultan's personal bodyguard. But they got really good at killing sultans.
Yeah, so I was saying that they rebelled then against
They rebelled against a couple of them.
Owen, something like that was his name.
Abdul Hamid.
No, it was his name was Osman.
Okay. Oh, yeah, I think I know what you're talking about.
They rebelled against Osman.
Now, without a strong army, the Ottoman borders could not be properly secured. Like, for example, Napoleon invaded Egypt in 1798 and then invaded the Ottoman Empire. And that allowed Egypt to break free from Ottoman rule in 1798. And then Greece broke away in 1830. Serbia broke away in 1867. So the empire was being chipped apart. One of the sultans, a guy named Selim III, tried to reorganize the Ottoman military based on a European model. Wanted to buy European weapons, hired European advisors to train the army, got up new recruits to be in this new model army to fight the same way as the Europeans did. But this threatened the Janissary Corps because the Janissary Corps were more traditional. And the Janissary Corps rebelled, killed the Sultan, and killed most of his family.
So they got to a point that it was Janissaries ruling the government.
Yep, pretty much. Because the Janissaries would kill the Sultan and put in power people they could
They
control.
were the ones that saying who's going to be in power right now.
Yep. So Selim III was murdered, and nearly all other male members of his dynasty were slaughtered, and all of the recruits that joined the new model army were slaughtered. The Janissaries killed them all. And the only survivor from that massacre was a man named Mahmud. And the Janissaries put Mahmud in power. He was named Mahmud II as Sultan. He was the sole survivor of the Janissary revolt, and he too began pushing reforms, but he disguised them as a restoration of traditional values. And that kept the Janissaries under control, because he convinced the Janissaries that he was their puppet, while secretly undermining them. In 1826, he proposed for a European-style army, which caused another Janissary mutiny. Only this time he was ready for it, because he had found members of the military that were loyal to the Sultan. So he comes out in 1826 and said, we're going to build a European-style military. The Janissaries rebelled, and the military that was loyal to the Sultan massacred the Janissaries, breaking their power forever. Between 1839 and 1876, the Ottoman government entered what's called the Tanzimat period. They were trying to reform their system from the top to bottom, mirroring what Europe had done. The Ottoman legal system was reformed to mirror the European justice system. There were individual rights to privacy, trial, and legal equality. And the education reforms were put in place, including state-funded primary education. Now, the Tanzimat system for the civic side of the government came to an end under the rule of this guy, Abdul Hamid II. He ruled from 1876 to 1909. He killed so many of his opponents, he was known as the Assassin Sultan. He pushed Tanzimat just for the military, but cracked down on the general population, reversing a lot of the reforms that had been put in place by his predecessors. So resistance to Hamid's rule sparked a coup, staged by a political party known as the Young Turks. They weren't young, but that's just what they called themselves. The Young Turks called for universal voting rights, equality under the law, freedom of religion, state-funded public education, the emancipation of women, and the secularization of the government. The Young Turks wanted to turn the Ottoman Empire into a Western-style government that would not be ruled purely by Islamic law. They also, however, tried to force Turkish to be the official language of the empire, which flared ethnic tensions. Because the Ottoman Empire still controlled a lot of ethnic groups. They ruled over ethnic Armenians, they ruled over Arabs, they ruled over Lebanese, Jordanians, Syrians, Hungarians, Romanians. They had all these different ethnic groups living under the empire. And because of nationalism being what it is, the Young Turks were like, well, nationalism is working for Europe, so we should embrace nationalism here. But if we do that, then all of the ethnic groups within the empire are going to want independence. So here's what we do. We make everybody Turkish, and then we push nationalism based on Turkish. But if you've got someone coming up to you saying, that language that you've spoken since you were born, you can't speak it anymore. That religion that you've worshipped since you were born, you can't worship it anymore. How are you going to feel about that? You're going to be pretty upset. So despite the reform attempts, the Ottoman Empire continued to crumble. Subject people continued to press for independence, and the Ottoman armies still could not compete with European ones. By the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire existed only because it was propped up by other European countries. They had pretty much lost their sovereignty. We'll pick this up again in a later class. That'll do it for today.